Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to support us. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city you're watching from. Now let's get into the case. Daniel Martinez checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes, a nervous habit he'd developed since taking on the responsibility of organizing this year's family reunion. 6 hours of driving from San Diego to Yosemite National Park had left him with a stiff back and a mild headache, but the excitement of seeing his extended family again after 3 years kept his spirits high. His wife, Elena, sat beside him in the passenger seat, scrolling through the final checklist on her phone. "Did you remember to pack the portable grill?" she asked, not looking up from her screen. "Yes, it's in the back with all the camping equipment," Daniel replied, his eyes fixed on the winding mountain road ahead. In the rearview mirror, he could see their children, Sofia and Miguel, both teenagers now absorbed in their own worlds with headphones on, oblivious to the breathtaking scenery outside their windows. The Martinez family had been planning this reunion for months. As the designated organizer, Daniel had reserved 3 adjacent cabins in Yosemite's Curry Village for 3 nights in late June. The weather forecast promised perfect conditions: warm days, cool nights, and clear skies for stargazing. 24 family members were expected to attend, coming from various parts of California, and a few flying in from as far as Chicago and Boston. The GPS announced their arrival at Yosemite National Park, and Daniel felt the familiar sense of awe as they passed through the entrance gate. The massive granite formations of El Capitan and Half Dome loomed in the distance, standing as ancient sentinels over the valley. Despite having visited Yosemite several times before, the majesty of the landscape never failed to humble him. Park. Entrance fee is $35 for a 7-day pass, the park ranger at the entrance booth said, smiling at the family. She was a middle-aged woman with sun-weathered skin and a friendly demeanor. Daniel handed over his credit card. "We have reservations at Curry Village for the next 3 nights. The ranger nodded, processing the payment. "Just so you know, we've had increased bear activity in the valley this season. Make sure to use the food lockers at your cabin and don't leave any food or scented items in your vehicle." "We've got the bear safety pamphlet from the reservation information," Elena chimed in from the passenger seat. "We'll make sure everyone follows the guidelines." "Good to hear," the ranger replied, handing back Daniel's credit card along with a park map. "If you see a bear, remember to keep at least 50 yards away. Enjoy your stay in Yosemite." Daniel thanked her and continued driving toward Curry Village. As they ventured deeper into the park, he mentally reviewed the bear safety protocols they'd read about. Food storage was paramount. Bears had an extraordinary sense of smell and could detect food from miles away. All food, trash, and scented items needed to be stored in the metal food lockers provided at each cabin when not in use. "Dad, when are Uncle Carlos and Aunt Maria getting here?" Sofia asked, finally removing her headphones as they approached their destination. "They texted earlier to say they were about an hour behind us," Daniel replied. "They should be here around dinner time." Elena turned to face the back seat. "Remember, guys, we need to be extra careful with food this weekend. No snacks in the cabin or in your backpacks when we go hiking." Miguel rolled his eyes. "Mom, we know, you've told us like 100 times already." "Well, I'm making it 101, Elena said firmly. "Bears are no joke, especially this time of year when they're actively searching for food." Daniel nodded in agreement. "The ranger just mentioned they've had increased bear activity this season. We need to make sure all of our relatives understand the importance of proper food storage too." They arrived at Curry Village, a collection of canvas tents and wooden cabins nestled at the base of Glacier Point. Their reserved cabins were located at the eastern edge of the complex, offering a bit more privacy and a spectacular view of Half Dome. Daniel parked their SUV in the designated lot and began the process of unloading their belongings. The cabins were rustic but comfortable, each equipped with 4 beds, a small table with chairs, and a simple bathroom. Outside each cabin was a large metal food locker, designed specifically to be bear-resistant. As they unpacked, Daniel made sure to immediately transfer all food items from their coolers to the locker. "Let's get everything set up before the others arrive," Daniel suggested, organizing their supplies. "Miguel, can you help me with the heavier bags? Sofia, you and Mom can start arranging the sleeping areas." For the next hour, the family worked together to set up their temporary home. Daniel had reserved the 3 adjacent cabins strategically, one for his immediate family, one for his parents and unmarried sister, and one for his brother Carlos's family. The rest of the extended family would be staying in the canvas tents nearby or in other accommodations throughout the park. By late afternoon, more family members began to arrive. Daniel's parents, Roberto and Carmen Martinez, pulled up in their sedan, followed closely by his sister Lucia. The joy of reunion momentarily overshadowed the organizational details as hugs were exchanged and updates on family news shared. "Mijo, you look tired already," Carmen said, cupping Daniel's face in her hands. "Are you taking on too much with this reunion?" Daniel laughed. "I'm fine, Mom, just a long drive. Elena and the kids have been a great help." Roberto clapped his son on the shoulder. "You picked a beautiful spot, Daniel. It's been too long since we've all been together like this." As the Sauraic afternoon progressed, more relatives arrived. Daniel's brother Carlos, his wife Maria, and their 3 children came next, followed by cousins, aunts, and uncles. The reunion was officially underway, with laughter and conversation filling the air around their cabins. Daniel had planned a welcome dinner for everyone that first evening, with food prepared in advance and brought in coolers. They set up a picnic area near their cabins, using the communal grills provided by the park to heat up pre-cooked meals. As the family gathered to eat, Daniel stood to make a toast. "To family," he said, raising a plastic cup of lemonade. "It's been 3 years since we were all together, and I'm grateful to see everyone here healthy and happy. We have a lot of activities planned for the next few days. Hiking, swimming, stargazing, but most importantly, we have time to reconnect and make new memories together." A chorus of "To family" echoed as everyone raised their cups. After dinner, as the sun began to set, Daniel reminded everyone about the bear safety protocols. "Remember, all food and scented items need to go in the bear boxes before we turn in for the night. That includes toiletries like toothpaste and deodorant too." His uncle Mateo laughed. "You're being paranoid, Sobrino. I've been camping all my life and never had a problem with bears." Daniel remained serious. "The rangers said there's increased bear activity this season. Black bears in Yosemite are generally shy around humans, but they're opportunistic when it comes to food. I'd rather be safe than sorry." Elena backed him up. "It's not just about our safety, it's about the bears too. When bears get access to human food, they become dependent on it and can become dangerous. Then they often have to be relocated or even euthanized." This sobered the group, and they all agreed to follow the protocols diligently. As darkness fell, the family gathered around a designated fire pit for marshmallow roasting and storytelling. The stars emerged in breathtaking clarity, far from the light pollution of cities. Daniel's father, Roberto, took charge of the storytelling, recounting tales of their family's history in California, dating back to his own grandfather's immigration from Mexico in the 1920s. The younger children listened with wide eyes, while the teenagers pretended disinterest but secretly absorbed every word. Around 10 o'clock, park quiet hours began, and the family dispersed to their respective accommodations. Daniel made one final check of the area, ensuring that all food and scented items were securely stored in the bear boxes. With everything in order, he joined Elena and their children in their cabin. "Day 1 down," he sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed to remove his shoes. "Everyone seems to be having a good time." Elena smiled, already in her pajamas and arranging her pillow. "You've done a great job organizing everything, Danny. Try to relax and enjoy it too, okay?" Daniel nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow's activities. They had scheduled a group hike to Lower Yosemite Falls in the morning, followed by free time in the afternoon for families to explore on their own. Dinner would be a larger affair, with grilled food and a birthday celebration for his niece Gabriela, who was turning 16 during the reunion. As the family settled into bed, the sounds of the forest surrounded them, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, distant calls of nocturnal birds, and the occasional hoot of an owl. Despite his exhaustion, Daniel found it hard to fall asleep immediately. He listened to the steady breathing of his family members and felt a deep contentment. The reunion was off to a good start. Unknown to the sleeping Martinez family, approximately 2 miles away, a 3-year-old male black bear was on the move. The bear, weighing about 250 pounds, had recently been pushed out of his mother's territory and was establishing his own range. Spring and early summer were challenging times for bears in the park. Natural food sources were still relatively scarce, and the influx of human visitors meant increased opportunities for finding calorie-rich human food. This particular bear, which park rangers had designated YV32, Yosemite Valley, Bear 32, had already learned that human structures often contained food. Though never officially classified as a problem bear, YV-32 had been spotted near campgrounds and picnic areas several times in the past month. Rangers had successfully hazed him away using noise deterrents on 2 occasions, but the lure of easy meals kept bringing him back to human-occupied areas. Tonight, driven by hunger and the lingering scent of the Martinez family's dinner, YV-32 was making his way toward Curry Village. Daniel awoke early the next morning, around 5:30 a.m., before the rest of his family. The early summer sun was already casting a golden glow across the valley. He quietly slipped out of bed, pulled on a sweatshirt against the morning chill, and stepped outside to enjoy a moment of solitude before the day's activities began. The air was crisp and pine-scented, filled with the morning chorus of birds. Daniel walked a short distance from the cabin and found a granite boulder to sit on, taking in the breathtaking view of Half Dome, illuminated by the rising sun. These quiet moments were rare in his busy life as a high school math teacher in San Diego, where the demands of work and family left little time for reflection. After about 20 minutes, he returned to the cabin to find Elena awake and starting the coffee maker they'd brought from home. "Morning," she smiled, still in her pajamas with her dark hair tousled from sleep. "I was wondering where you'd gone. Just enjoying the view," Daniel replied, giving her a kiss on the cheek. "Should we start getting breakfast ready for everyone? The hike to Lower Yosemite Falls is scheduled for 9 o'clock. Elena nodded. "I'll wake the kids in a bit." "Why? Don't you check on your parents and see if they need any help?" Daniel agreed and headed over to the neighboring cabin where his parents and sister were staying. He found them already awake, with his father Roberto sitting outside on a small chair, nursing a cup of coffee. "Buenos dias, hijo," Roberto greeted him. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" "It sure is, Dad," Daniel replied, sitting down next to him. "Did you sleep okay?" Roberto nodded. "Like a log. Your mother, on the other hand, complained about the mattress half the night." He chuckled fondly. 52 years of marriage, and she still surprises me with new things to worry about. Inside the cabin, Carmen and Lucia were organizing their belongings for the day. Daniel offered to help with breakfast, and soon the 3 cabins were bustling with activity as the extended family prepared for the day ahead. Breakfast was a communal affair, set up at the picnic tables between their cabins. Elena and Carmen had prepared a spread of pastries, fruit, yogurt, and granola bars. Coffee and hot chocolate were brewed on portable camp stoves. As family members gathered to eat, Daniel went over the plan for the day. The hike to Lower Yosemite Falls is about a mile-round trip on an easy trail, he explained. It's suitable for everyone, including the little ones. We should be back by lunchtime, and then everyone can do their own thing this afternoon. Miguel, now fully awake and on his second pastry, looked up. "Dad, can Jake and I go to the visitor center this afternoon? They have this cool exhibit about the geology of the valley." Jake, Carlos's 15-year-old son, nodded enthusiastically. "And they have a 3D model of the entire park." "Sure, as long as you stay together and keep your phones charged," Daniel agreed. After breakfast, everyone helped clean up and secure all food items in the bear boxes before setting out for the hike. The group of 24 family members made quite a sight as they walked together toward the Yosemite Falls trailhead, ranging in age from Carmen and Roberto in their 70s to Carlos's youngest 4-year-old Lily, who rode on her father's shoulders. The hike was indeed easy, with a paved path leading through a peaceful forest before opening up to a spectacular view of Lower Yosemite Falls. The waterfall was especially impressive in June, fed by snowmelt from the higher elevations. The family spent time taking photos and admiring the view before heading back to Curry Village for lunch. During lunch, Daniel noticed a park ranger posting a new sign near the entrance to the dining area. Curious, he walked over to read it. Bear advisory. Multiple bear sightings in the Curry Village area last night. Please use extra caution with food storage. Report all bear sightings to park staff immediately. The ranger, a tall man with a trim beard, noticed Daniel's concern. "Just a precaution," he explained. "We had reports of a young male black bear getting into some unsecured trash cans around midnight. No direct encounters with visitors, but we like to keep everyone informed." "We've been very careful with our food storage," Daniel assured him. "Any specific areas we should avoid?" "The bear was last seen heading east toward the trailhead to Mirror Lake," the ranger replied. "Our wildlife team is monitoring the situation. Just keep following the standard protocols. Proper food storage, maintain distance if you see a bear, and no hiking alone at dusk or dawn when bears are most active." Daniel thanked him and returned to his family with the information. "Looks like we need to be extra vigilant," he told Elena quietly, not wanting to alarm the younger children. "There was a bear in the area last night." Elena's eyes widened slightly. Should we change our plans for tonight's dinner? Daniel considered this. They had planned a larger cookout for dinner, with hamburgers and hot dogs on the grill to celebrate his niece Gabriella's birthday. Let's stick with the plan, but be extremely careful about food handling. No leaving anything unattended, even for a minute, and we'll clean up immediately after we're done. The afternoon passed pleasantly, with family members splitting off into smaller groups to explore different areas of the park. Daniel and Elena took their children, along with Carmen and Roberto, on a scenic drive to Glacier Point for its spectacular overlook of the valley. Others went swimming in the Merced River, visited the Ansel Adams Gallery, or simply relaxed at their cabins. By late afternoon, the family reconvened to prepare for the birthday dinner. Daniel had reserved a larger picnic area equipped with multiple grills, tables, and a designated fire pit for the evening. Carlos and Daniel worked together to get the grills going, while the rest of the family set up decorations for Gabriella's celebration. As the hamburgers and hot dogs sizzled on the grills, Daniel kept a watchful eye on their surroundings, remembering the bear advisory. The picnic area was well populated with other park visitors, which was reassuring. Bears typically avoided areas with lots of human activity. Gabriella's birthday celebration was a success. The 16-year-old blushed with pleasure as the family sang happy birthday and presented her with a small cake that her mother, Maria, had specially transported from their hometown bakery. After dinner and cake, as the sun began to set, the family once again gathered around the fire pit for more storytelling and reminiscing. "Remember when Daniel fell into the swimming pool at his own graduation party?" Carlos teased, sending the group into laughter. Daniel groaned. "I was trying to save that squirrel that had fallen in. How was I supposed to know it could swim better than I could?" Stories flowed freely as marshmallows were roasted and stars began to appear overhead. The younger children gradually grew tired, and families with little ones began to head back to their accommodations around 9 o'clock. Daniel organized a cleanup crew to ensure that no food or trash was left behind at the picnic area. "Remember," he reminded everyone, "all food, toiletries, and anything with a scent goes in the bear boxes tonight." By 10:30, most of the family had retired to their cabins and tents. Daniel made one final round to check that all bear boxes were properly secured before joining Elena in their cabin. Sofia and Miguel were already in bed, though both were still awake, scrolling through their phones. "Phones off in 15 minutes, Elena reminded them as she prepared for bed. Daniel sat down on their bed with a contented sigh. "I think this reunion is exactly what everyone needed. It's good to see the whole family reconnecting." Elena nodded in agreement. "Your mom seems especially happy. I overheard her telling your Aunt Teresa that she was worried about not seeing everyone together again at her age." This gave Daniel pause. His parents were in their 70s now. His father recently recovered from a minor heart procedure. The reality that they wouldn't always be around for these gatherings hung unspoken in the air. "All the more reason to make these moments count," he said softly. The cabin grew quiet as the family settled into sleep. Outside, the night sounds of the forest created a soothing, natural soundtrack. Daniel drifted off, mentally reviewing plans for their third and final day in Yosemite tomorrow. Unknown to the sleeping Martinez family, YV-32, the young male black bear, was once again on the move in the Curry Village area. Despite the ranger's hazing efforts the previous night, the bear had returned, drawn by the lingering scents of the day's meals. Black bears typically preferred to avoid human contact, but this particular bear had learned that human areas often provided easy food rewards with minimal risk. Around 2:30 a.m., YV-32 lumbered between cabins, nose working constantly to detect any food scents. The bear boxes had done their job effectively, frustrating his attempts to access the stored food inside. However, as he approached the Martinez family's cabin, he detected something the family had overlooked: a small tube of lip balm that Sofia had absent-mindedly left in the pocket of her jacket, which hung on a hook just inside the screened porch of their cabin. It was a tiny oversight, but to a bear's sensitive nose, the fruity scent of the lip balm was as attractive as any food item. YV-32 approached the cabin's screened porch, drawn by the enticing smell. Daniel woke suddenly, unsure what had disturbed his sleep. He lay still for a moment, listening. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft breathing of his family. Then he heard it, a distinct snuffling sound coming from the direction of the porch. Years of camping experience immediately set off alarm bells in his mind. Carefully trying not to make sudden movements, Daniel sat up and peered toward the porch area. The cabin was dark, but enough moonlight filtered through the windows to reveal a large dark shape moving on the other side of the screen door. His heart rate instantly doubled. A bear, and it was interested in something on their porch. Daniel's mind raced through the bear safety protocols. Make noise, appear large, back away slowly if possible, never run, never get between a bear and an escape route. He reached over and gently shook Elena awake, placing a finger to his lips to signal silence. When her eyes opened, he whispered, as softly as possible, "There's a bear on the porch, I need to wake the kids, stay calm." Elena's eyes widened, but she nodded, years of trust in Daniel's judgment keeping her panic at bay. Daniel slipped out of bed and moved silently to Miguel's bunk first, then Sophia's, cupping his hand over their mouths before they could make startled sounds. "There's a bear outside," he whispered. "Stay very quiet and move slowly to the bathroom. Lock the door and don't come out until I say it's safe." The teenagers, instantly alert at the word bear, nodded and carefully climbed out of their bunks. Elena joined them, ushering them toward the small bathroom at the back of the cabin. On the porch, YV-32 was becoming more interested in the scent. The bear pressed against the screen door, testing its resistance. The flimsy screen material was never designed to keep out a determined bear. Daniel knew he needed to scare the bear away before it broke through the screen. With his family safely in the bathroom, he grabbed the small pot they had used to heat water for coffee and a metal spoon from their supplies. Traditional noise deterrents for bears included loud metallic sounds and authoritative voices. He moved to the center of the cabin, as far from the screen door as possible while still being visible to the bear, and began banging the pot with the spoon. "Hey bear, go away! Get out of here!" he shouted, trying to make his voice as deep and commanding as possible. The sudden noise startled YV-32, who backed away from the screen door momentarily. Daniel continued making noise, hoping the bear would lose interest and move on. For a few seconds it seemed to be working. The bear turned as if to leave. Then, in a heart-stopping moment, the bear turned back and charged at the screen door. Whether triggered by fear, confusion, or determination to get to the scented item, YV-32 hit the door with his full weight, tearing through the screen material with ease. Daniel felt a surge of primal fear as 250 pounds of black bear burst into the enclosed porch area of the cabin. He continued banging the pot and shouting, backing toward the inner door that separated the porch from the main cabin area. His only priority now was keeping the bear from entering the main cabin where the bathroom and his family were located. YV-32, now inside the enclosed porch, appeared momentarily confused by the confined space and the loud noise. The bear focused on Sophia's jacket, rising onto his hind legs to pull it down from the hook. In doing so, he was blocking the only exit from the porch to the outside. Daniel realized with growing dread that he was now trapped on the porch with the bear between him and the exit. The inner door to the main cabin was behind him, but opening, it might give the bear access to the rest of the cabin. His family's safety had to come first. Making a split-second decision, Daniel decided to try reaching the cabin's front window, which could serve as an alternative exit from the porch area. He needed to get outside and away from the cabin, which might draw the bear away as well. Still making noise, Daniel began edging along the wall toward the window. YV-32, having gotten hold of the jacket with the lip balm, seemed momentarily distracted with examining his prize. Daniel reached the window and tried to open it, but the latch was stiff from disuse. The noise of Daniel struggling with the window latch caught the bear's attention. YV-32 dropped the jacket and turned toward Daniel, likely perceiving him as a threat in the enclosed space. Black. Bears were generally not aggressive toward humans, but when cornered or startled, even typically docile animals could become dangerous. The bear made a huffing sound, a sign of agitation. Daniel knew the situation was escalating dangerously. With one powerful effort, he managed to unlock the window and push it open. As he began to hoist himself through the opening, YV-32 charged. Daniel felt a searing pain across his back as the bear's claws caught him in a defensive swipe. The force of the blow knocked him through the window, and he tumbled to the ground outside, landing hard on the dirt and pine needles. Inside the bathroom, Eleanor and the children heard the commotion and Daniel's cry of pain. Elena had already called 911 on her cell phone and was speaking in hushed, urgent tones to the dispatcher. "There's a bear in our cabin at Curry Village, Unit 42. My husband is out there trying to scare it away. Please send help immediately." Outside, Daniel scrambled to his feet, ignoring the burning pain across his back. He could see through the open window that YV-32 was now fully focused on the jacket and lip balm, temporarily losing interest in the human who had escaped. Daniel needed to alert neighboring cabins and get help. He ran to the adjacent cabin where his parents and sister were staying and pounded on the door. "Dad! Lucia! Wake up! There's a bear in our cabin!" The door opened almost immediately to reveal Lucia, already awake and alarmed by the shouting. "Daniel, you're bleeding!" she gasped, pulling him inside. "Call the ranger station," Daniel said urgently. "Elena and the kids are locked in the bathroom." The bear broke through the screen. Dora. Roberto was now awake and reaching for the cabin phone to call for help, while Carmen hurried to Daniel with a towel to press against his bleeding back. "Stay here," Lucia insisted as Daniel tried to move back toward the door. "You're injured. And you've done everything you can. Help is coming." Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air as park rangers responded to the emergency calls. 2 ranger vehicles pulled up near the cabins, and 4 rangers emerged, equipped with flashlights, bear spray, and what looked like tranquilizer guns. The commotion had also awakened many of the neighboring campers and cabin occupants, including the rest of the Martinez family. Carlos came running from his cabin, stopping short when he saw Daniel being attended to by Carmen. "Dios mío, what happened?" he asked, his face pale with shock. "Bear," Daniel replied through gritted teeth, the adrenaline beginning to wear off as the pain in his back intensified. "It's still in our cabin. Elena and the kids are in the bathroom." The rangers approached the cabin cautiously, communicating via radio. One of them, a woman with a name tag reading Ranger Bishop, came over to where Daniel was seated. "Sir, are you able to tell me exactly what happened?" she asked, her manner calm but urgent. Daniel quickly explained about the bear breaking through the screen door and his family being locked in the bathroom. "It seemed most interested in my daughter's jacket," he added. "I think there might be food or something scented in the pocket." Ranger Bishop nodded. "You did the right thing getting your family to safety and making noise to scare the bear. We'll handle it from here. Paramedics are on their way for your injuries." The other rangers had surrounded the cabin and were assessing the situation. Through the open window, they could see YV-32 still inside, now moving from the porch area into the main cabin, likely searching for more food scents. "It's YV-32, one ranger called to Bishop, "the same bear from last night's sightings." "Ranger," Bishop turned back to Daniel, "we're going to tranquilize the bear and remove it from the cabin. Once it's secure, we'll get your family out safely. The paramedics should be here in about 10 minutes. As if on cue, another siren could be heard in the distance. Daniel nodded, feeling slightly lightheaded from the pain and blood loss. The claw marks across his back were deep, though not life-threatening. The rangers executed their plan with practiced efficiency. One positioned himself at the open window with a tranquilizer gun, while the others maintained positions around the cabin to ensure the bear couldn't escape without being noticed. "Bear is in view," the ranger at the window reported. "Taking the shot." There was a soft popping sound as the tranquilizer dart was fired, followed by a startled grunt from inside the cabin. The rangers waited, giving the sedative time to take effect. After about 5 minutes, Ranger Bishop approached the front of the cabin and carefully peered through the torn screen door. "Bear is down," she confirmed over her radio, "sedated and breathing normally. Let's move in and secure it." 2 rangers entered the cabin cautiously, while Bishop went to the bathroom door and knocked gently. "Mrs. Martinez, park rangers. The bear has been sedated and it's safe to come out now." The bathroom door opened slowly to reveal Elena, her arms protectively around Sofia and Miguel. All 3 looked pale and frightened, but unharmed. "My husband?" Elena asked immediately. "He's outside being treated for some lacerations on his back," Bishop explained. "Paramedics are on their way. Your family did everything right in this situation." Elena and the teenagers were escorted from the cabin as the other rangers prepared to remove the sedated bear. YV-32 was a substantial animal, requiring a specialized stretcher and 4 rangers to carefully move him from the cabin to a transport vehicle. Outside, the paramedics had arrived and were attending to Daniel's injuries. They had cut away his blood-soaked t-shirt to reveal 4 deep claw marks running diagonally across his back from his right shoulder blade to the left side of his lower back. "You're going to need stitches, sir," one paramedic informed him as they cleaned the wounds and applied pressure bandages. "We'll transport you to the medical clinic in the valley. The wounds don't appear to have damaged any major blood vessels or organs, but they'll need to be thoroughly cleaned to prevent infection." Elena rushed to Daniel's side, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Danny, are you okay?" Daniel managed a pained smile. "I'll be fine. Are you and the kids all right?" Elena nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "We're fine, thanks to you. Miguel and Sofia are with your parents." As Daniel was being prepared for transport to the medical clinic, Ranger Bishop approached with a small notebook. Mr. Martinez, I know this is difficult timing, but I need to get your statement about the incident while it's still fresh. This information helps us manage bear-human interactions in the park. Daniel agreed and gave a detailed account of the encounter while the paramedics finished stabilizing him for transport. He mentioned the lip balm in Sophia's jacket pocket, which Ranger Bishop confirmed they had found. That explains the bear's interest in your cabin, she noted. Even small scented items can attract bears. Your quick thinking prevented what could have been a much worse situation. By now, it was nearly 4 a.m., and much of Curry Village was awake due to the commotion. Park staff had arrived to assist the displaced Martinez family, offering them temporary accommodations for the remainder of the night. As Daniel was loaded into the ambulance, the sedated YV-32 was also being transported in a ranger vehicle to a remote location miles from the developed areas of the park. According to protocol, the bear would be released once the sedative wore off, with rangers monitoring to ensure it moved away from human-populated areas. "What will happen to the bear?" Miguel asked one of the rangers, his voice revealing a mixture of fear and concern for the animal. "We'll relocate it to a more remote area of the park," the ranger explained. "This appears to be its first direct encounter with humans, so we follow a 3 strikes policy. If it continues to seek out human food and has more encounters, more serious management actions might be necessary." Miguel nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the situation. The family had inadvertently put both themselves and the bear at risk through one small oversight. The ambulance departed for the Yosemite Medical Clinic with Daniel and Elena inside, while the rest of the family regrouped to figure out their next steps. What had been planned as a joyful family reunion had taken an unexpected and frightening turn. At the medical clinic, Daniel received 27 stitches across his back to close the 4 claw marks. The doctor, experienced in treating wildlife injuries, thoroughly cleaned the wounds and administered antibiotics to prevent infection. "You're fortunate," Dr. Weaver told Daniel as he worked. "Black bear attacks are extremely rare, and when they do occur, they're often more serious than this. The bear wasn't trying to prey on you, it was just defending itself in a confined space. These are defensive wounds, not predatory ones." Daniel lay on his stomach on the examination table, wincing occasionally as the doctor worked. "Will there be scarring?" he asked. "Yes, these will leave scars," Dr. Weaver confirmed, "but they'll fade somewhat over time. You'll have quite a story to tell, though I imagine it's not the souvenir you were hoping for from your Yosemite visit." Elena sat nearby, still looking shaken by the night's events. "How common are bear break-ins at the cabins?" she asked. "Not common at all when proper food storage protocols are followed," the doctor replied. "From what the rangers reported, it was a small tube of lip balm that attracted this particular bear. It's a reminder of just how sensitive their sense of smell is. They can detect food scents from over a mile away." By sunrise, Daniel had been treated and prescribed pain medication and antibiotics. The doctor advised him to follow up with his regular physician once he returned home to San Diego and to watch for any signs of infection like increased redness, swelling, or fever. As they left the clinic, they found Carlos waiting for them in his car, ready to drive them back to Curry Village. The sun was just beginning to illuminate Half Dome, creating a surreal golden glow that contrasted sharply with the night's frightening events. "How are you feeling, Hermano?" Carlos asked as Daniel carefully settled into the passenger seat, positioning himself to avoid pressure on his injured back. "Like I went a few rounds with a bear and lost," Daniel replied, attempting humor despite his discomfort. "How's everyone else doing?" "Shaken up," Carlos admitted. "The kids are pretty freaked out, especially the younger ones, but also kind of impressed that their Uncle Daniel fought a bear." "I didn't fight it," Daniel corrected quickly. "I ran from it, which is exactly what everyone should do." When they arrived back at Curry Village, they found park staff had already repaired the screen door on their cabin and thoroughly cleaned the interior. The family's belongings had been collected and moved to a different cabin further from the forest edge. The extended family gathered around Daniel as he returned, expressing concern and relief at his relatively minor injuries considering the circumstances. Daniel's father, Roberto, embraced him carefully. "You protected your family," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of you, son." As the family discussed their plans for the day, it became clear that the bear encounter had cast a shadow over the reunion. Some of the relatives with young children were understandably nervous about remaining in the park, while others felt it was important to continue with their plans and not let the incident completely derail their time together. "Why don't we do this?" Daniel suggested, grimacing slightly as he shifted position on the chair where he was seated. "Those who want to head home early, no one will think any less of you. The rest of us can modify our plans for a more low-key day, maybe just hang out here at the village, or take a gentle walk to one of the meadows." This compromise seemed to satisfy everyone. About a third of the extended family decided to cut their visit short, packing up to leave after breakfast. The rest, including Daniel's immediate family, chose to stay for the final day as planned, though with less ambitious activities scheduled. Throughout the morning, park rangers stopped by to check on the family and provide updates. Ranger Bishop informed them that YV32 had been successfully relocated to a remote area of the park, about 7 miles from any developed facilities. "He woke up from the sedation and moved immediately into the forest," she reported. "Our wildlife management team will monitor the area over the next few days to ensure he doesn't return to human-populated zones." Bishop also asked if the Martinez family would be willing to participate in an educational initiative. "We're always looking for real-life experiences to help educate visitors about bear safety," she explained. "Your story, how one small overlooked item led to a serious incident, could help prevent similar situations in the future." Despite his discomfort, Daniel agreed. "If sharing our experience helps someone else avoid this, then something good can come from it." Later that morning, a park videographer came to interview Daniel and his family about their encounter. I spoke candidly about the oversight with the lip balm and how quickly the situation had escalated. "I've always been careful about food storage when camping," Daniel told the camera, sitting carefully to accommodate his bandaged back. "But I never thought about something as small as a tube of lip balm being a problem. Now I know that anything with a scent, food, toiletries, even some medicines, needs to be secured in bear-proof containers." Sophia, still visibly upset about her role in the incident, added her perspective. "I just didn't think about my lip balm being food to a bear. I feel terrible that my dad got hurt because of my mistake." Daniel put his arm around his daughter. "It was an oversight any of us could have made. The important thing is that we all learned from it, and no one was seriously hurt, including the bear." The remainder of their final day in Yosemite was spent quietly. Daniel, limited by his injuries, stayed mainly at the cabin, reading and resting. Eleanor and the children joined some of the remaining relatives for a short walk to one of the nearby meadows, where they spotted deer grazing peacefully in the late morning sun. That evening, the smaller group gathered for a subdued final dinner. The conversation inevitably returned to the bear encounter, with family members processing the event through discussion. "I've been coming to national parks for 40 years, Uncle Mateo commented, "and never had a close encounter like that. Makes you realize we're just visitors in their home." Daniel's mother, Carmen, who had been unusually quiet throughout the day, finally spoke up. "When I heard the commotion and then saw Daniel bleeding, I thought we might lose him." Her voice trembled slightly. "It reminds you how precious family is and how quickly things can change." This sentiment resonated around the table, bringing the group back to the original purpose of their reunion, to celebrate their connections and shared history. Despite the unexpected turn of events, the core mission of the gathering had been fulfilled, perhaps even strengthened by the shared experience of the crisis. As the sun set on their final evening in Yosemite, the family's mood gradually lightened. Carlos broke out a guitar he had brought and began playing traditional Mexican songs their parents had taught them as children. Soon, everyone was singing, along the music creating a sense of normalcy and joy that had been briefly lost. Daniel, watching his family come together in song, felt a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude for their safety, pain from his injuries, and a deeper appreciation for the fragile beauty of both human relationships and the natural world. The bear, YV32, had acted according to his nature, seeking food where his keen sense of smell detected it. There was no malice in the animal's actions, just the imperative of survival. The next morning, the remaining family members packed up to depart Yosemite. Daniel, moving carefully to avoid straining his stitches, supervised the loading of their SUV, while Elena checked out of their cabin. Ranger Bishop stopped by one last time as they were preparing to leave. "Just wanted to see how you're doing. And thank you again for participating in our educational video," she said. "Your experience will help other visitors understand the importance of proper food storage." Daniel shook her hand. "Glad to help. Will the video be available online? I'd like to share it with my students back home." "Absolutely," Bishop confirmed. "It will be part of our bear safety materials on the park website and shown at the visitor center. We'll email you when it's available." As the family drove toward the park exit, Daniel looked back at the majestic landscape of Yosemite Valley in the rearview mirror. Half Dome stood proudly against the blue sky, eternal and unchanged by the human dramas that played out beneath it. Somewhere in the forests surrounding the valley, YV-32 was likely foraging for natural food sources, berries, insects, nuts, hopefully forgetting the easy temptation of human food that had led to the previous night's confrontation. The drive back to San Diego was slower and more uncomfortable than the journey to Yosemite had been. Daniel had to take frequent breaks to stretch and change positions, as sitting for long periods put pressure on his healing wounds. Elena drove most of the way, with Miguel taking a turn for the final stretch. They arrived home late that evening, all 4 family members exhausted from the journey and the emotional weight of the past 48 hours. As they unpacked the car, their neighbor, Mrs. Reyes, came over to welcome them back. "How was the family reunion?" she asked cheerfully. Daniel and Elena exchanged glances, unsure how to summarize their experience. "It was memorable," Daniel finally replied with a wry smile. "I'll tell you about it sometime when we're not so tired." That night, as Daniel lay on his stomach in their bed, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, he found himself mentally replaying the encounter with the bear. The memory of those terrifying moments when YV-32 broke through the screen door was vivid. The bear's huffing breaths, the sound of claws on the wooden floor, the primal fear he'd felt when cornered in the enclosed porch. Elena, sensing his restlessness, placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You saved us," she said softly. "You did everything right." Daniel sighed. "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently, if I'd checked Sophia's jacket pockets, if I'd managed to scare the bear away before it broke in." "Danny, stop," Elena interrupted firmly. "You can't control everything. One tiny oversight, and yes, it had consequences, but we're all safe, even the bear is safe. Let that be enough." She was right, of course. The what-ifs could drive a person mad if allowed to take root. The reality was that they had experienced a frightening encounter with a wild animal and emerged relatively unscathed. The next day, Daniel called his primary care physician to schedule a follow-up appointment for his injuries. Dr. Patel examined the stitched wounds carefully, nodding with approval at the emergency treatment he'd received at Yosemite. "These are healing nicely," she commented. "Keep them clean and dry and continue the antibiotics until they're finished. The stitches can come out in about 10 days. "Will the scarring be significant?" Daniel asked, echoing the question he'd posed to the doctor in Yosemite. Dr. Patel nodded honestly. "You'll have visible scars, yes. 4 distinct lines across your back. They'll fade somewhat over time and with proper care, but they'll be permanent reminders of your encounter." Daniel accepted this reality with a nod. In a strange way, he didn't mind having physical evidence of the experience, a testament to the wild nature of the world beyond human control. Over the next few weeks, as summer progressed and Daniel's wounds gradually healed, the bear encounter became a defining story for the Martinez family. Friends and colleagues wanted to hear the tale, and Daniel found himself repeatedly sharing the experience, each telling helping to process the trauma and integrate it into his life narrative. At school, where Daniel taught high school mathematics, the story earned him a new nickname among students, Bear Man. He leveraged their interest to incorporate lessons about wildlife conservation and human-wildlife interactions into his classroom discussions when appropriate. 6 weeks after the incident, Daniel received an email from Ranger Bishop at Yosemite National Park. Attached was a link to the completed educational video featuring the Martinez family's experience, now part of the park's official bear safety materials. That evening, the family gathered around their computer to watch the video. It was professionally produced, interspersing their interview footage with facts about black bears in Yosemite and guidelines for proper food storage. Bear encounters in Yosemite National Park are relatively rare, the narrator explained, and attacks are even rarer. However, as the Martinez family discovered, even small oversights can lead to dangerous situations. The video showed footage of YV-32 and other black bears in the park, explaining their biology, behavior, and the challenges they faced in an environment increasingly impacted by human visitors. When bears become habituated to human food, they often stop foraging naturally and begin to associate people with easy meals, the narrator continued. This puts both bears and humans at risk. The video concluded with Daniel's earnest message to future park visitors. Remember that we're guests in their home. One small mistake almost cost us our lives, and potentially the life of the bear. Be vigilant, follow the guidelines, and respect these amazing animals from a safe distance. As the video ended, The family sat in thoughtful silence for a moment. "Do you think it will help?" Sophia asked eventually. "Will people listen?" Daniel considered this. "Some will. If even one family watches this and becomes more careful with their food storage, then it's worth it." Miguel, now 16 and increasingly interested in environmental issues, added his perspective. "Hey, it's weird to think that Bear is still out there somewhere in Yosemite, just living his bear life. I wonder if he remembers us." "If he does," Eleanor said with a small smile, "I hope it's with enough wariness to stay far away from humans in the future." That summer marked a turning point for the Martinez family in their relationship with the natural world. Their experience had stripped away any romantic notions about wilderness, replacing them with a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the realities of wild places and the creatures that inhabited them. Daniel's scars healed into 4 distinct lines across his back, pink at first, then gradually fading to silvery white against his tan skin. They became conversation starters, opportunities to share the lessons learned from their encounter. When the family went camping the following summer, this time at a coastal campground far from bear territory, their attention to proper food storage was meticulous. The experience had transformed them from casual outdoor enthusiasts to thoughtful practitioners of responsible wilderness interaction. Occasionally, Daniel would see news reports about bear encounters in national parks across the country. Some ended tragically, with the bears being euthanized after becoming too habituated to human food and too bold around people. He would think of YV32, hoping the young bear had returned to natural foraging patterns after their encounter. A year after the incident, Daniel received another email from Yosemite National Park. This one was from a different ranger, informing him that their educational video had become a standard part of the visitor orientation at Yosemite and several other national parks. It included a brief update on YV32. "The bear involved in your incident has not been observed in developed areas since his relocation. Wildlife biologists spotted him last month in the high country, foraging on natural food sources and showing appropriate wariness around humans. Your experience may have helped save this bear from developing more problematic behaviors." Daniel shared this news with his family over dinner that evening, feeling a sense of closure. Their frightening encounter had served a purpose beyond their own education. It had potentially saved the bear's life and helped protect other park visitors. Life continued its normal rhythms for the Martinez family. Daniel's teaching, Elena's work as a nurse, the teenager's progression through high school toward college. But the memory of those terrifying moments in Yosemite remained vivid, a reminder of the thin veneer of control humans maintained in a world that remained fundamentally wild. On occasion, Daniel would dream of the encounter. In these dreams, unlike reality, he would find himself unable to escape, the bear's powerful form looming over him as he tried to protect his family. He would wake from these nightmares with his heart racing, the phantom sensation of claws across his back, causing him to reach around and touch the scars, reassuring himself that he had survived. These dreams became less frequent over time, but never disappeared entirely. They served as subconscious reminders of human vulnerability in the face of nature's raw power. 2 years after the incident, the Martinez family held another reunion, smaller this time, and hosted at their home in San Diego. As relatives gathered in their backyard for a barbecue, the conversation inevitably turned to reminiscences of the Yosemite reunion and the bear encounter. "You know," Daniel's father Roberto said thoughtfully, nursing a glass of iced tea, "that bear taught our family something important. How to respect nature without fearing it. How to be careful without being paranoid." Daniel nodded, absently, running his hand across his back where the scars lay hidden beneath his shirt. "It also taught us how quickly life can change, how one moment can divide your experience into before and after." "Do you ever think about going back to Yosemite?" Carlos asked. Daniel considered the question. "Actually, yes. Not to exorcise any demons or anything like that, just to appreciate it again now that the immediate fear has faded." Eleanor, overhearing the conversation as she brought out a tray of food, added her perspective. "I think we should. It's too beautiful a place to let one frightening experience keep us away forever." The following summer, the Martinez family did return to Yosemite, though they opted for a different accommodation, a lodge in Wawona, away from Curry Village with its memories. They hiked familiar trails, marveled at the waterfalls and granite formations, and yes, spotted several black bears at safe distances, foraging peacefully in meadows. Standing at Glacier Point, overlooking the spectacular vista of the valley below, Daniel felt a complex emotion that mixed respect, awe, and a healthy dose of caution. The wilderness was not a theme park or a backdrop for human adventures. It was a living system with its own rules and imperatives. YV-32 had simply been following his bear nature that night in the cabin, seeking the calorie-rich foods his instincts told him were necessary for survival. As Daniel gazed out at the landscape, he absently traced the scars on his back through his shirt. They had become part of him now, as integral to his identity as any other aspect of his life experience. They told a story, not just of pain and fear, but of survival, adaptation, and a deeper understanding of his place in the natural world. In the distance, a golden eagle soared on thermal currents, and somewhere in the forests below, bears continued their ancient patterns of life, occasionally intersecting with the human world, but largely separate from it. Daniel took a deep breath of the pine-scented air and felt grateful for his family's safety, for the lessons learned, and for the wild beauty that continued to exist despite the encroachment of human development. The scars on his back would remain for the rest of his life, faint lines telling a story that few would believe without evidence, a story of a brief, terrifying encounter with the wild heart of nature, personified in the form of a young black bear following its instincts in a human-altered landscape. A story that had changed him, not just physically, but in his understanding of the delicate balance between humans and the natural world. As the family drove home from that return visit to Yosemite, Daniel felt a sense of peace that had been elusive since the bear encounter. The fear had not disappeared entirely. He knew it would always remain as a healthy respect for wild animals and wild places. But it no longer dominated his memories of Yosemite or his feelings about the outdoors. Life continued to unfold for the Martinez family. Sophia went off to college to study environmental science, partly inspired by their bear encounter and its aftermath. Miguel developed an interest in wildlife photography, capturing images of animals in their natural habitats with a patience and respect born from understanding their true nature. And Daniel continued to bear the marks of his encounter, literally and figuratively. When asked about the scars, he would tell the story matter-of-factly without embellishment or drama. It needed none. The reality was dramatic enough. "I had a close encounter with a black bear in Yosemite," he would explain. "We both survived. The bear taught me something important about respecting the wild." Years passed, and the bear encounter became one story among many in the family's history, though perhaps the most dramatic. Daniel's scars faded further, but remained visible, permanent reminders of that night when the wild had broken through the thin barrier of civilization and reminded a family of their place in the natural order. In reflective moments, Daniel sometimes wondered about YV-32, the bear who had left his mark so literally. Had he lived out his natural lifespan in the forests of Yosemite? Had he encountered other humans, perhaps more carefully this time? These questions had no answers, but they kept the connection alive in Daniel's mind. The unlikely, brief, and momentous intersection of two lives from different worlds. The lessons of that encounter extended beyond the Martinez family through the educational video that continued to be shown to Yosemite visitors. In this small way, their experience rippled outward, potentially preventing similar incidents and saving both human lives and bear lives in the process. And somewhere in the forests of Yosemite, bears continued to roam, following ancient patterns of life largely unchanged by human presence. YV-32, or others like him, moved through their world with little awareness of the stories humans told about them, the fears they inspired, or the lessons they inadvertently taught. They were simply bears being bears, in a world increasingly shaped by human hands but still wild at its heart. For Daniel Martinez, the bear encounter had become more than a frightening memory or an interesting anecdote. It had become a touchstone, a moment when the ordinarily separate worlds of human and wild had collided, leaving both forever changed in ways both visible and invisible. The scars on his back were just the surface manifestation of a deeper transformation, a newfound respect for the power of nature and an understanding of his own place within it. And in that understanding, Daniel had found not fear, but a profound appreciation for the wild heart that continued to beat beneath the surface of the modern world, reminding humans, if they would listen, that they remained part of something larger than themselves, something ancient and powerful and ultimately beyond control. Every year since the incident, on the anniversary of the bear encounter, the Martinez family made a small donation to wildlife conservation efforts. It was their way of acknowledging the complex relationship between humans and wild animals and of taking responsibility for their part in maintaining a world where bears and humans could coexist albeit at a respectful distance. And life went on, shaped by that one wild night but not defined by it. The scars remained, telling their silent story on Daniel's back, but they were just one chapter in the ongoing narrative of a family making their way through a world both familiar and strange, civilized and wild, predictable and full of unexpected encounters. The early morning sunlight filtered through the pines surrounding Elizabeth Baker's mountain home in Evergreen, Colorado. At 52, Elizabeth had lived in these mountains for only 3 years, but she'd quickly developed a deep appreciation for the rugged beauty of the Rockies and the peaceful solitude they offered. After decades of living in Denver's suburbs, she and her husband Mark had finally realized their dream of a mountain retreat, a modest 3-bedroom cabin with large windows that framed spectacular views of Mount Evans in the distance. This late May morning carried the fresh scent of spring in the crisp mountain air. Elizabeth pulled on her gardening gloves, eager to make progress on her vegetable garden before the midday heat set in. The small plot of land adjacent to the east side of their cabin had taken considerable work to prepare. The rocky mountain soil had required amendments and raised beds to create a viable growing environment, but Elizabeth found profound satisfaction in coaxing food from the challenging terrain. "I'm heading out to the garden," she called to Mark, who sat at the kitchen table, his attention fixed on his laptop as he reviewed patient files. As a pediatrician at a clinic in Idaho Springs, he often brought work home, especially after their move to the mountains had increased his commute. Oh, okay," Mark replied distractedly, glancing up briefly. "Don't forget we're meeting the Hendersons for dinner at 6. Elizabeth smiled, used to her husband's divided attention when work occupied his mind. "I remember. I'll be back in well before then. I'm just putting in the tomato seedlings and checking on the peas." She stepped outside onto the wooden deck, pausing to fill her lungs with the pine-scented air. Their property stretched across 3 acres of partially wooded land, offering privacy from the handful of neighboring cabins scattered along Ridge Road. The absence of fencing had been a deliberate choice. They'd wanted their home to blend seamlessly with the surrounding wilderness, to feel connected to, rather than separated from, the natural world. Elizabeth descended the steps from the deck, her rubber gardening clogs crunching on the gravel path that led to her garden plot. The raised beds she and Mark had built last summer waited, their fresh soil dark and rich against the weathered wood frames. She'd started the tomato seedlings indoors 2 months earlier, nurturing them under grow lights until they were ready for transplanting. Now, with the danger of frost past, she could finally settle them into their summer home. She knelt beside the first bed, placing her tray of seedlings and gardening tools on the ground beside her. The soil felt cool and damp beneath her fingers as she began digging the first hole. Birds called from the surrounding trees, their songs punctuated by the occasional chattering of a squirrel. Elizabeth worked methodically, completely absorbed in the satisfying rhythm of gardening. She didn't notice the black bear approaching from the tree line. The bear, a young male about 3 years old, had emerged from the dense forest that bordered the eastern edge of the Bakers' property. He moved with the characteristic rolling gait of his species, his nose lifted to sample the air. At approximately 200 pounds, he was of average size for a male black bear in Colorado. His dark fur gleamed in patches where sunlight penetrated the canopy, and his small ears swiveled attentively as he navigated the unfamiliar terrain. This particular bear had been ranging increasingly widely over the past few weeks, pushed by both natural instinct and mounting hunger. The previous winter had been harsh, and he'd emerged from hibernation leaner than ideal. Now, driven by the biological imperative to regain weight, he followed his sensitive nose toward potential food sources. The bird feeders hanging from the eaves of the baker's deck had caught his attention first, the sweet scent of scattered sunflower seeds and sweat making a promising target. The mountain community had experienced an increasing number of bear encounters in recent years as development expanded into wildlife habitat, but Elizabeth and Mark, still relatively new to mountain living, had not yet internalized the precautions that longtime residents considered second nature. Elizabeth was so focused on creating the perfect planting hole for her prized Brandywine tomato seedling that the soft crunching of leaves behind her didn't immediately register as a threat. It wasn't until a shadow fell across her workspace that she realized she wasn't alone. Turning her head slightly, expecting perhaps to see Mark coming to check on her progress, Elizabeth instead found herself looking at the dark, furry legs of a black bear standing less than 10 feet away. Time seemed to crystallize in that moment. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat as her eyes traveled upward, taking in the massive form of the bear. His head was lowered, nose working as he sniffed the air, apparently more interested in identifying scents than in her presence. But the proximity was terrifying, close enough that she could see the claws on his paws and the moisture on his snout. Elizabeth's mind raced through fragmented memories of bear safety information she'd half listened to when they'd first moved to the mountains. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Back away slowly. Don't turn your back. Too many contradictory instructions crowded her thoughts as panic began to rise in her chest. The bear, meanwhile, seemed more curious than aggressive. He tilted his head slightly, dark eyes fixed on Elizabeth as she remained frozen in her kneeling position. For several seconds, neither moved. The woman and the bear locked in a silent assessment of each other. Then Elizabeth, operating on instinct rather than reason, suddenly rose to her feet, raising her arms in an attempt to appear larger. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice emerging higher and more strained than she'd intended. "Get out of here!" Thou. Bear, startled by her abrupt movement and loud voice, reared back slightly on his hind legs. This defensive posture, often misinterpreted as aggression, was actually the animal's way of gaining a better vantage point, using his superior sense of smell to evaluate the situation. But to Elizabeth, it appeared as a prelude to attack, and her fear intensified. "Mark!" she screamed toward the house, never taking her eyes off the bear. "Mark!" Inside, Mark looked up from his computer, momentarily confused by the panic in his wife's voice. When a second, more desperate scream reached him, he pushed back from the table and rushed to the window. What he saw sent a surge of adrenaline through his system, Elizabeth standing rigid with fear as a black bear loomed just a few yards away from her. "Elizabeth, don't move!" he yelled, though the closed windows muffled his voice. He scrambled for the door, his mind racing to remember what they should do in this situation. They'd received pamphlets about wildlife safety when they'd moved in, but like many new residents, they'd set them aside, intending to read them thoroughly someday. Outside, the bear dropped back to all fours, still watching Elizabeth with what appeared to be curiosity rather than aggression. But when she took a single step backward, her foot caught on the corner of the raised bed. Elizabeth stumbled, arms flailing as she fought to regain her balance. The sudden movement triggered the bear's defensive instincts. In one fluid motion, he lunged forward and swiped at her with his right front paw, not a dedicated attack but a warning, an attempt to create distance from the perceived threat. But the power behind even this instinctive action was considerable, and his claws connected with Elizabeth's left forearm as she raised it protectively. Pain exploded through Elizabeth's arm as the bear's claws tore through the fabric of her light jacket and into her flesh. She screamed, more from shock than pain in that initial moment, and fell backward onto the ground. The bear, apparently as startled by the contact as she was, took a few steps back, huffing and swaying his head from side to side in agitation. Blood began to seep through Elizabeth's sleeve, and the sight of it triggered a wave of dizziness. She pressed her right hand against the wound, trying to stem the flow while keeping her eyes on the bear. He remained several feet away, clearly unsettled, but not retreating. Mark burst through the front door onto the deck, the screen door slamming behind him with a bang that momentarily diverted the bear's attention. Seizing the opportunity, Mark grabbed the garden hose coiled near the steps, twisted the nozzle to its strongest setting, and directed a forceful stream of water toward the animal. The bear, confronted with this new stimulus, flinched as the water hit his face. He shook his head, pouring at his eyes, then turned and lumbered toward the tree line, periodically looking back as if to ensure he wasn't being pursued. Within moments, his dark form disappeared into the dense undergrowth at the edge of the property. "Elizabeth!" Mark dropped the hose and rushed to his wife's side, his medical training kicking in as he assessed her condition. She sat on the ground, pale and shaking, her right hand clutched over her left forearm where blood seeped between her fingers. Let me see," he urged, gently prying her hand away to examine the wound. 3 deep gashes ran diagonally across her forearm, the middle one particularly concerning in its depth. "We need to get you to the emergency room," he said, helping her to her feet. "Can you walk to the car?" Elizabeth nodded mutely, shock beginning to set in as the adrenaline ebbed. She leaned heavily against Mark as they made their way to their SUV parked in the gravel driveway. "The bear," she managed, looking back toward the tree line. "Where did it go?" "It's gone for now," Mark assured her, though he too cast a nervous glance toward the forest. "Let's get you taken care of first, then we'll call the rangers." The drive to the nearest emergency room in Evergreen felt interminable to Elizabeth, whose arm throbbed with increasing intensity as the initial shock wore off. Mark had wrapped a clean dish towel around her forearm before they left, but blood had already soaked through the makeshift bandage by the time they pulled into the hospital parking lot. The emergency department staff responded quickly when Mark identified himself as a doctor and explained the nature of the injury. Elizabeth was taken immediately to an examination room where a nurse carefully removed the blood-soaked towel to reveal the full extent of the damage. "Bear attack?" the attending physician, Dr. Reyes, asked as she donned gloves and began examining the wounds. "Yes," Mark confirmed. "Black bear at our property in Evergreen. It swiped at her once and then retreated when I sprayed it with the hose." Dr. Reyes nodded, her expression grave as she assessed the 3 parallel gashes. "The good news is that these don't appear to have damaged any major blood vessels or tendons, but they're deep, especially this middle one. We'll need to thoroughly clean and debride these wounds. Bear claws carry a lot of bacteria, then sutures, antibiotics, and we'll want to update her tetanus if needed." Elizabeth winced as the doctor gently probed the edges of the wounds. "Will there be permanent damage?" she asked, her voice tight with pain. "There will be scarring," Dr. Reyes replied honestly, "but with proper care, I don't anticipate any significant functional impairment. You're fortunate. Bear attacks can be much worse." The treatment process was lengthy and painful. First, a local anesthetic was administered, though it couldn't completely eliminate the discomfort of the thorough cleaning the wounds required. Dr. Reyes worked methodically, irrigating each gash with sterile saline solution and carefully removing any foreign material, dirt, fabric fibers, and other debris that had been introduced during the attack. "We take animal attacks very seriously," she explained as she worked. "The risk of infection is significant, particularly with wildlife. Bears' claws can harbor a variety of bacteria from the soil and from whatever they've been handling or eating." Once the wounds were cleaned to her satisfaction, Dr. Reyes began the meticulous process of suturing the gashes closed. The middle wound, the deepest of the 3, required multiple layers of stitches to properly close the damaged tissue. In total, Elizabeth received 37 stitches across the 3 lacerations. "You'll need to keep these wounds clean and dry," Dr. Reyes instructed as she applied an antimicrobial ointment and sterile dressings. "I'm prescribing a course of broad-spectrum antibiotics to prevent infection, and you should watch carefully for any signs of increased redness, swelling, warmth, or discharge. If you notice any of those, come back immediately." While Elizabeth was being treated, Mark stepped out to call Colorado Parks and Wildlife to report the bear encounter. He spoke with a ranger named Jason Alvarez, who took down the details of the incident and their location. "We've had several reports of bear activity in that area recently," Ranger Alvarez informed him. "With the late spring we had this year, many bears are more food-stressed than usual. They're coming out of hibernation hungry and finding natural food sources still limited." "What happens now?" Mark asked. "Will you try to relocate the bear?" "We'll send someone out to assess the situation," Alvarez replied, his tone carefully neutral. "But I should tell you that when a bear injures a human, even if it's a relatively minor injury, our options become limited. The bear may be euthanized if we can identify and capture it." Mark felt a surprising pang of regret at this news. Despite the fear and danger of the situation, he didn't necessarily want the bear's death on his conscience. "It seemed more scared than aggressive," he offered. "It only swiped at Elizabeth when she stumbled." "That's often the case," Alvarez acknowledged. "Most bear encounters don't involve predatory behavior, but our policy prioritizes public safety, and once a bear has had a physical encounter with a human, the risk of future incidents increases." By the time Mark returned to the examination room, Elizabeth was sitting up, her bandaged arm resting on a pillow in her lap. The color had returned to her face, though she still looked shaken by the ordeal. "How are you feeling?" he asked, taking the seat beside her. "Better now that the pain medication has kicked in," she replied with a weak smile. "Did you reach the wildlife people?" Mark nodded. "They're sending someone out to check the property. They've had other reports of bear activity in our area." He hesitated, unsure whether to share the potential fate of the bear. Elizabeth seemed to read his thoughts. "They'll try to kill it, won't they?" she asked quietly. "They said it's a possibility," Mark admitted. "Their policy is pretty strict when a bear injures someone, even if it was just a defensive reaction." Elizabeth was silent for a moment, processing this information. "It's not the bear's fault," she finally said. "We're the ones who moved into its territory, and those bird feeders probably attracted it." Mark squeezed her hand gently. "The ranger mentioned that. Apparently bird feeders are one of the most common attractants. We should have taken down ours after winter." "I didn't know," Elizabeth sighed. There's probably a lot we don't know about living safely with wildlife. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Reyes returning with discharge papers and prescriptions. "You're good to go, Mrs. Baker. Take the antibiotics exactly as prescribed, keep the wounds clean, and come back in 2 days for a wound check. Sooner if you notice any signs of infection." Elizabeth nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted as the events of the morning caught up with her. "Thank you, doctor." As Mark helped Elizabeth to the car, her thoughts returned to the bear. "I hope they don't find it," she murmured. "It was just doing what bears do." Mark didn't respond immediately, torn between agreement with his wife's sentiment and the visceral fear he'd experienced seeing her in danger. "Let's focus on getting you home and comfortable," he said finally. "We can talk about the bear situation later." The drive home was quiet, Elizabeth drowsy from the pain medication as she leaned against the passenger window. Mark kept glancing at her bandaged arm, a surge of protectiveness washing over him each time. They had moved to the mountains seeking peace and connection with nature, but today had been a stark reminder of the inherent risks that came with that choice. As they turned onto Ridge Road, Elizabeth roused herself, looking anxiously toward their property. "Do you think it came back?" she asked. "I doubt it," Mark replied, though he slowed the car as they approached their driveway, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Bears typically avoid areas after a negative encounter. A Colorado Parks and Wildlife truck was parked in their driveway, and a uniformed ranger stood near the garden beds examining the site of the attack. Mark parked beside the official vehicle, and the ranger approached as they exited their car. "Mr. and Mrs. Baker, I'm Ranger Alvarez. We spoke on the phone," he said, extending his hand to Mark before nodding respectfully to Elizabeth, clearly noting her bandaged arm. "How are you doing, ma'am?" "I've been better," Elizabeth replied with a weak smile. 37 stitches and a prescription for some serious antibiotics." Alvarez nodded sympathetically. "Bear encounters can be traumatic, even when they don't result in physical injury. I've been examining the area and found some clear tracks. Appears to be a medium-sized black bear, probably a young male based on the paw size." "Have you seen any sign that it's still around?" Mark asked, instinctively moving closer to Elizabeth. "No recent activity that I can detect," Alvarez assured them. "But I did notice several potential attractants on your property." He gestured toward the bird feeders hanging from the eaves. "Those are the most obvious issue. Birds don't actually need supplemental feeding during the warm months, and the seeds are irresistible to bears." Elizabeth's expression fell. "We didn't realize. We've only lived here 3 years, and no one ever mentioned we should take them down in spring." "It's a common oversight," Alvarez said kindly. "Would you mind if I walk the property with you and point out a few other concerns? Knowledge is your best defense against future encounters." Though Elizabeth was tired, she nodded agreement. Understanding how to prevent another incident seemed worth the additional exertion. For the next half hour, Ranger Alvarez led them around their property, identifying potential bear attractants they'd never considered. The compost pile near the vegetable garden, the outdoor grill they rarely cleaned thoroughly, the trash cans they sometimes left outside the night before pickup, all represented invitations to hungry bears. "Black bears have an incredible sense of smell," Alvarez explained. "They can detect food odors from over a mile away, and once they find an easy food source, they'll remember and return to it repeatedly. So we've basically been setting out a bear buffet," Mark said grimly. Alvarez smiled slightly. "Many new mountain residents do the same. It's not intentional, just unfamiliar territory. Bears are naturally wary of humans and prefer to avoid us, but hunger is a powerful motivator that can override that caution." "What about the bear that attacked me?" Elizabeth asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Will you have to kill it?" Alvarez's expression turned serious. "We'll set up some trail cameras to monitor activity in the area. If we can identify the specific bear and it returns, we may need to take action. But truthfully, without distinctive markings, it can be difficult to identify individual bears with certainty." Elizabeth felt a small relief at this. "So if it just stays away, then nature takes its course," Alvarez finished. "Our primary concern is public safety. The best outcome is that the bear returns to natural food sources and avoids human habitation going forward." As they completed their circuit of the property, Alvarez handed them several informational pamphlets about living safely in bear country. "I'd recommend reading through these and implementing as many of the suggestions as possible. Simple changes can dramatically reduce the likelihood of future encounters." After the ranger departed, promising to check back in a few days, Mark helped Elizabeth inside and settled her on the couch with her arm elevated on a cushion. The pain medication was wearing off, and a persistent throbbing had begun beneath the bandages. "I should call the Hendersons and cancel dinner," Mark said, reaching for his phone. "Maybe ask if they can come here instead," Elizabeth suggested. "I could use the distraction, and I don't feel up to going out, but I don't want to just sit here thinking about what happened either." Mark nodded, squeezing her shoulder gently before stepping into the kitchen to make the call. Elizabeth could hear his muted voice explaining the situation, followed by expressions of concern from the other end of the line. Left alone with her thoughts, Elizabeth's mind returned to those terrifying moments in the garden, the bear's dark eyes, more curious than malevolent, the surprise in its posture when she had suddenly stood, the almost casual way it had swiped at her when startled by her stumble, a reflex rather than an attack. And yet that reflexive action had sent her to the emergency room and might ultimately cost the animal its life. There was a fundamental unfairness in that equation that troubled her. The bear had been following its nature, seeking food in a habitat increasingly encroached upon by human development. They, she and Mark and their neighbors, were the intruders, here not the wildlife whose territory they now occupied. Mark returned, interrupting her ruminations. "The Hendersons are bringing dinner here at 6. Carol was horrified when I told her what happened and insists on handling everything." Elizabeth nodded, grateful for the kindness of their friends, but still preoccupied with thoughts of the bear. "Mark, we need to take down those bird feeders right away and implement the other changes Ranger Alvarez suggested." "We will," Mark assured her, sitting beside her on the couch. "First thing tomorrow, I'll take care of it all." "No," Elizabeth said firmly. "The feeders at least need to come down today. That bear could come back at any time looking for more food." Mark studied his wife's determined expression, recognizing the slight clench in her jaw that signaled she wouldn't be swayed. "Okay," he agreed. "I'll take them down now." While Mark went outside to remove the bird feeders, Elizabeth carefully maneuvered herself into a more comfortable position on the couch. The pain in her arm had intensified to a steady throb that radiated from wrist to elbow. She glanced at the prescription bottles on the coffee table, calculating how much longer until she could take another dose of pain medication. Through the living room window, she watched Mark using a stepladder to reach the bird feeders hanging from the eaves. With each one he removed, she felt a twinge of regret. She had enjoyed watching the colorful mountain birds that had frequented their feeders, but the memory of the bear's powerful form and the casual strength in its swipe overrode that sentiment. Mark returned with 4 feeders, placing them in a storage bin. "Done," he reported, "and I cleaned up all the scattered seed underneath them." "Thank you," Elizabeth said, managing a small smile despite her discomfort. "I know it seems like an overreaction, but it's not an overreaction," Mark interrupted gently. "You were injured, Liz. You could have been killed. If taking down a few bird feeders makes our property less attractive to bears, it's a small price to pay." The mention of price reminded Elizabeth of another concern. "The hospital bill, our insurance deductible is $5,000. Mark waved away her worry. "We've got the emergency fund for exactly this kind of situation. Besides, your safety is worth any amount." Their conversation was interrupted by the ringing of the doorbell. Mark glanced at his watch. That can't be the Hendersons already. It's only 4:30. He went to answer the door, while Elizabeth shifted to see who had arrived. Through the open doorway, she could see their nearest neighbor, Dan Knowles, standing on the porch. Dan and his wife Sarah had lived on Ridge Road for over 20 years, their cabin situated about a quarter-mile down the road from the Bakers. "Mark, Sarah just called and told me what happened," Dan said, his weathered face creased with concern. "Bear attack," she said. "Is Elizabeth all right?" "She's got some nasty cuts on her arm, but she'll be okay," Mark replied, stepping back to allow Dan inside. "She's in the living room." Dan approached the couch, his expression softening with sympathy when he saw Elizabeth's bandaged arm. "Damn, I'm sorry this happened to you. Sarah and I should have been more proactive about talking to you folks about bear safety when you moved in." "It's not your responsibility," Elizabeth assured him. "We should have educated ourselves better." Dan shook his head. "Those of us who've been up here a while know the risks. We should look out for newcomers." He glanced at Mark. "Did the ranger mention they've been tracking a young male bear in this area for the past few weeks? He's been getting bolder, showing up in people's yards during daylight hours." "He mentioned there had been other reports," Mark said, "but not that they were tracking a specific bear." "Well, they've been keeping it quiet to avoid panicking people," Dan explained. "But this is the 3rd incident this month. No injuries until now, but he got into the Petersons' garage last week and made a hell of a mess." Elizabeth frowned. "Why haven't they relocated it already if they know it's becoming a problem?" "Resources," Dan replied with a shrug. "They're stretched thin, and relocation isn't always successful anyway. Bears often find their way back to familiar territory, especially if there are reliable food sources. The conversation shifted to practical advice as Dan shared his experiences from 2 decades of mountain living. He recounted his own close encounter with a bear that had broken into his shed several years earlier, emphasizing the importance of bear-proof storage for anything that might emit food odors. Even things you wouldn't think of as food can attract them, he warned. Birdseed, pet food, livestock feed, compost, garbage, hell, even some cosmetics and toiletries with strong scents can draw them in. By the time Dan left, promising to check in on them the next day, Elizabeth's head was swimming with new information and precautions. The simplicity of mountain living she had imagined when they'd purchased the cabin now seemed naive in retrospect. Living harmoniously with wildlife required more knowledge and vigilance than she had anticipated. The Hendersons arrived promptly at 6, bearing a casserole, a salad, and a bottle of wine. Carol, a nurse at the same clinic where Mark worked, immediately went into caregiver mode, insisting on checking Elizabeth's bandages and reminding her about the importance of keeping the wound clean. Bear attacks are no joke, Carol said, as she helped Elizabeth adjust her position to elevate her injured arm. One of our patients last summer, an older gentleman, was surprised by a bear while hiking. He survived, but the recovery was lengthy. I consider myself fortunate, Elizabeth replied, looking down at her bandaged arm. It could have been much worse. The conversation over dinner inevitably centered on the morning's events, with both the Hendersons expressing the appropriate mixture of concern and fascination. Like many who choose to live in wilderness-adjacent areas, they had a deep respect for wildlife tempered by a realistic understanding of potential dangers. We had our own wake-up call our first year here, Tom Henderson shared. Found a bear trying to get into our trash cans at 2 in the morning. Made a hell of a racket. After that, we invested in bear-proof containers and got serious about the other precautions. As the evening progressed, Elizabeth found herself growing increasingly fatigued, the combination of physical trauma, medication, and emotional stress taking its toll. Noticing her drooping eyelids, Carol tactfully suggested that they should leave and let her rest. After the Hendersons departed, Mark helped Elizabeth to bed, carefully arranging pillows to keep her injured arm elevated. Try to get some sleep, he urged, placing her medication and a glass of water on the nightstand. I'll check on you through the night. You don't have to do that, Elizabeth protested weakly, though she was touched by his concern. I'm a doctor. Checking on patients is what I do, he replied with a small smile, leaning down to kiss her forehead. Besides, I'm not sure I'll sleep much tonight. Anyway. As Mark turned out the light and left the room, Elizabeth stared into the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of their cabin. Sounds that had once seemed charming now carried a hint of menace as her mind replayed the morning's events on an endless loop. The bear's dark eyes, the surprising speed of its movement, the casual power behind its swipe, the searing pain as claws tore through flesh. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. Each time she began to drift off, her mind would jerk her back to wakefulness, with vivid recreations of the attack or imagined scenarios of what might have happened if the bear had been more aggressive or if Mark hadn't heard her screams. It was past midnight when she finally fell into a restless sleep, only to be awakened shortly after 4 by a sharp pain in her arm. The medication had worn off, and the throbbing had intensified to an insistent stabbing sensation. Elizabeth reached for the pills on her nightstand, fumbling in the dark, then paused as a sound from outside caught her attention. A shuffling noise, followed by what sounded like scratching. Her heart rate accelerated immediately, her mind conjuring images of the bear returning, perhaps drawn by lingering scents from the bird feeders. She strained to listen, trying to determine if the sounds were real or products of her anxious imagination. Another noise, a distinct thud followed by more scratching. This was no figment of her imagination. "Mark," she whispered urgently, reaching across to shake her husband's shoulder. "Mark, wake up." He stirred groggily. What is it? Are you in pain?" "There's something outside," Elizabeth hissed, her voice tight with fear. "I think the bear might be back." That got his attention. Mark sat up, fully alert now, and listened. The scratching noise came again, this time accompanied by a low huffing sound that was unmistakably ursine. "Stay here," Mark instructed, sliding out of bed and reaching for his phone on the nightstand. "I'm going to call Ranger Alvarez's emergency number." "Be careful," Elizabeth urged, clutching the bed covers with her uninjured hand as Mark slipped from the room. Left alone, she strained to track both the sounds outside and Mark's muffled voice from the living room. The scratching seemed to be coming from the vicinity of the deck. Perhaps the bear was investigating the places where the bird feeders had hung, searching for seeds that might have been missed in the cleanup. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, Mark returned to the bedroom. "Alvarez is sending someone out, but it'll be at least 45 minutes, he reported in a low voice. He said to make sure all doors and windows are secured and to stay inside. "Is it definitely a bear?" Elizabeth asked, though she already knew the answer. Mark nodded grimly. "I turned on the deck lights and saw it from the living room window. Looks like the same one from this morning, similar size at least." A loud crash from outside made them both jump. "What was that?" Elizabeth gasped. "I'm not sure," Mark replied, moving cautiously to the bedroom window that overlooked the back of the property. "I can't see from this angle. It sounded like it came from near the garden." Elizabeth felt a surge of irrational anger. "Those tomato plants. Better be safe. I'm not getting mauled just to have a bear destroy my garden anyway." The unexpected comment, born of stress and fear, surprised a small laugh from Mark. "Only you would be worried about your tomatoes at a time like this." The moment of levity was short-lived as another crash, louder than the first, reverberated through the night. This was followed by the distinct sound of splintering wood. "That's it. I'm not just sitting here waiting," Mark declared, heading for the closet. He emerged moments later with a powerful flashlight and the air horn they kept for hiking. "You stay put. I'm going to try to scare it off." "Mark, no," Elizabeth protested, struggling to sit up. "The ranger said to stay inside." "I'm not going outside," he assured her. "Just going to make some noise from the deck. Bears typically avoid loud sounds and bright lights." Before she could argue further, Mark was gone. Elizabeth heard the living room door open and the sound of the screen door closing. Her heart hammered in her chest as she imagined her husband confronting the bear, armed with nothing more than a flashlight and an air horn. The blaring sound of the horn cut through the night. 3 long blasts that must have carried across the entire valley. This was followed by Mark's voice, amplified by adrenaline and fear, shouting wordless warnings into the darkness. For a moment, silence fell. Then Elizabeth heard a crashing sound from the direction of the forest, growing rapidly fainter, the sound of a large animal retreating through underbrush. Relief flooded through her, followed almost immediately by renewed pain from her injured arm, which she had unconsciously tensed during the ordeal. Mark returned to the bedroom, his face flushed with adrenaline, but wearing an expression of triumph. "I think it worked. I saw it running back toward the tree line." "Thank God," Elizabeth breathed, sinking back against her pillows. "That was incredibly foolish, you know." "Calculated risk," Mark countered, setting the air horn on the dresser. "I stayed on the deck, kept the door open behind me for a quick retreat, and made enough noise to wake the entire county." Despite her lingering fear, Elizabeth couldn't help but smile at her husband's pleased expression. "My hero," she said, only half sarcastically. "Now hand me those pain pills before my arm falls off." By the time a wildlife officer arrived, a younger man named Torres rather than Alvarez, the property was quiet. The bear had indeed retreated into the forest, leaving behind overturned garden tools and a damaged compost bin as evidence of its visit. He was definitely looking for food, Officer Torres confirmed after examining the area with his flashlight. "The good news is that he didn't try to enter your home. That would indicate a more dangerous level of habituation to humans." "Is it the same bear they've been tracking in the area?" Mark asked, referring to what Dan had told them earlier. Torres looked surprised by the question. "I'm not at liberty to discuss ongoing wildlife monitoring," he replied carefully. "But I can tell you that we're aware of increased bear activity in this vicinity and are taking appropriate measures." The non-answer was telling in its evasiveness. Elizabeth, who had insisted on joining them for the inspection despite Mark's objections, exchanged a glance with her husband. "What happens now?" she asked the officer. "Will you set traps or something?" Torres shook his head. "Not based on this incident alone. The bear was attracted by potential food sources, but retreated when confronted. That's actually normal, healthy bear behavior." He gestured toward the damaged compost bin. "I would definitely recommend replacing that with a bear-proof version, though, and implementing all the other precautions I'm sure Ranger Alvarez discussed with you earlier." After Torres departed, promising increased patrols in the area over the next few days, Elizabeth and Mark returned to bed, though neither expected to sleep much before dawn. The adrenaline of the second encounter had worn off, leaving Elizabeth shaky and exhausted, but still too keyed up for sleep. "We should never have moved here," she said suddenly, voicing the thought that had been lurking at the edges of her consciousness since the morning attack. "We're not equipped for this kind of living." Mark turned to face her in the darkness. "You don't mean that. You love it here." I loved the idea of it, she corrected. The reality is turning out to be more complicated. All living situations have their challenges, Mark pointed out. Remember the flooding in our basement in Denver, or the time that drunk driver crashed into our front yard? Elizabeth sighed, acknowledging the truth in his words. I know, it's just, I never expected to feel afraid in my own yard. The fear will fade, Mark assured her, reaching over to squeeze her hand. And we'll be smarter now. We'll take all the precautions, educate ourselves properly. This is still our dream home, Liz. She wanted to believe him, to recapture the sense of peace and connection to nature that had drawn them to mountain living in the first place. But as she finally drifted towards sleep in the early hours of the morning, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The wilderness she had viewed with such romantic idealism now revealed its sharper edges, demanding not just appreciation, but respect and caution. Dawn broke clear and bright, sunlight filtering through the pine trees surrounding the property and casting dappled patterns across the bedroom floor. Elizabeth woke to find Mark already up and moving quietly around the room, dressed for the day. What time is it? She asked groggily, wincing as pain shot through her arm when she tried to sit up. Just after 6, Mark replied, coming to help her. I called the clinic and told them I won't be in today. Then I made some calls about bear-proof containers. A company in Idaho Springs can deliver and install them this afternoon. Elizabeth blinked, impressed by his efficiency. You've been busy. Couldn't sleep, he admitted. Kept thinking about what else needed to be done to secure the property. He handed her the pain medication and a glass of water. How's the arm? Feeling? Like I got into a fight with a bear and lost, she replied dryly, swallowing the pills. But the pain is more bearable than last night. Mark smiled at the unintentional pun. I'm going to change your bandages after breakfast. And speaking of breakfast, I'm making blueberry pancakes. Comfort food seemed appropriate. As Mark headed to the kitchen, Elizabeth carefully got out of bed, testing her balance. The pain medication from the night before had left her slightly lightheaded, and she moved cautiously as she made her way to the bathroom. The face that greeted her in the mirror looked pale and drawn, with dark circles under her eyes, testifying to her restless night. Washing one-handed proved challenging, but she managed a rudimentary morning routine before joining Mark in the kitchen. The smell of pancakes cooking brought a welcome sense of normalcy to a situation that still felt surreal in the light of day. I thought we could eat on the deck, Mark suggested as he flipped a perfectly golden pancake. It's a beautiful morning, and the wildlife officer said the bear is unlikely to return so soon after being frightened off. Elizabeth hesitated, glancing toward the glass doors that led to the deck. The idea of sitting outside, exposed, sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest. Maybe we could eat at the kitchen table today, she said, trying to keep her voice casual, just until my arm feels a bit better. Mark turned from the stove, studying her face with the perceptive gaze that had made him an excellent diagnostician. Of course, he agreed easily, though she could see his concern. Kitchen table it is. Over breakfast, they discussed the practical steps needed to bear-proof their property. Mark had already compiled a list based on the informational pamphlets Ranger Alvarez had provided. Secure trash in bear-resistant containers, clean the grill thoroughly after each use, install motion-activated lights around the perimeter of the house, remove the compost pile or replace it with a bear-proof composter. It's going to be an expensive day, Elizabeth commented as she reviewed the list, but worth it for peace of mind. Mark nodded agreement. And beyond our immediate property, I think we should look into getting involved with community education efforts. Dan mentioned there's a local group that works on reducing human-wildlife conflicts. That's a good idea, Elizabeth said, surprised by her husband's enthusiasm for community involvement. Mark typically preferred quiet evenings at home to social engagements, but the events of the past 24 hours had clearly affected him as well. Maybe what happened to me could help prevent someone else from going through the same thing, or worse. After breakfast, Mark gently removed the bandages from Elizabeth's arm to check for signs of infection. The 3 parallel gashes looked angry and red against her pale skin, the black sutures stark and alien where they pulled the edges of torn flesh together. But there was no excessive swelling or discharge, which Mark assured her was a positive sign. The doctor did a good job with these, he commented as he carefully cleaned around the stitches with antiseptic. The scars should heal reasonably well over time. Elizabeth studied the wounds dispassionately, trying to view them as Mark did, clinically, professionally, rather than as permanent reminders of her vulnerability. Will they always be this visible, she asked. They'll fade, he replied, applying fresh bandages with practiced ease, But yes, you'll always have scars. They'll tell a pretty impressive story, though. The time I was stupid enough to get too close to a bear, Elizabeth suggested wryly. Mark shook his head. More like the time I survived a wild animal encounter that would have sent most people running for the nearest city apartment. His reframing brought a small smile to her face. There was some truth to it. Despite her fear and pain, Elizabeth hadn't once suggested they sell the cabin and move back to suburbia. The mountains had worked their way into her heart over the past 3 years, becoming home in a way that their previous house never had. The remainder of the morning passed in a flurry of activity as Mark tackled the most urgent items on their bear-proofing list. He dismantled the damaged compost bin, bagging the contents for proper disposal, and cleaned the grill with a thoroughness it hadn't seen since they'd purchased it. Elizabeth, limited by her injury but determined to contribute, made phone calls to local suppliers of bear-resistant equipment and researched community wildlife education programs on her laptop. Around noon, Ranger Alvarez called to check on their status and inquire about the overnight incident. Elizabeth put the call on speaker so both she and Mark could participate in the conversation. Officer Torres mentioned the bear seemed particularly interested in your compost bin, Alvarez noted. What kinds of things do you typically compost? Elizabeth thought about the contents she regularly added to the bin, mostly vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, eggshells, sometimes fruit peels and cores. Fruit waste is especially attractive to bears, Alvarez explained. If you want to continue composting, I'd recommend either a certified bear-resistant composter or keeping fruit waste out of the compost entirely. We've already ordered a bear-proof model, Mark informed him. Should be delivered later today. Excellent, Alvarez approved. That's exactly the kind of proactive response we hope for. Too often, people experience a bear encounter and either panic, wanting all bears removed from the area, or they do nothing, assuming it was a one-time occurrence. Trust me, once was enough, Elizabeth said with feeling. We're motivated to prevent a repeat performance. Have there been any other sightings in the area since last night? Mark asked, returning to his earlier concern about the bear's whereabouts. Nothing reported, Alvarez replied. Bears typically maintain a fairly large territory and don't necessarily stay in one location for long, especially after a negative encounter like the one last night. He's likely moved on to a different area within his range. After the call ended, Elizabeth found herself drawn to the window overlooking the tree line where the bear had disappeared the previous night. The forest looked peaceful in the midday sun, offering no hint of the danger that might lurk within its shadows. Had the bear truly moved on, or was it watching, waiting for another opportunity to investigate potential food sources? The thought sent a shiver through her despite the warmth of the day. Elizabeth had always considered herself reasonably outdoor savvy. She'd grown up camping and hiking with her family in Washington state, but this experience had humbled her. Living on the edge of wilderness required a different level of awareness, a constant mindfulness of the wild creatures with whom they shared this mountain. The afternoon brought deliveries of bear-resistant trash cans and a new composter, followed by the installation of motion-activated lights around the perimeter of the property. By evening, the cabin felt more secure, though Elizabeth still found herself starting at unexpected sounds and peering anxiously out of windows at the slightest movement in the trees. I think we've done everything we reasonably can for now, Mark said, as they prepared a simple dinner of pasta with garlic bread. The rest is just being vigilant and following the safety guidelines. Elizabeth nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I know, it's just going to take some time for me to feel completely comfortable again. Mark studied her face for a moment before speaking. You know, it's okay if you want to talk to someone professional about this. Traumatic experiences can leave psychological scars as well as physical ones. I don't think I need therapy for one bear encounter, Elizabeth protested, though the suggestion gave her pause. Was her anxiety disproportionate to the actual danger? I'm just being cautious, that's all. Of course, Mark agreed quickly. I just want you to know the option is there if you find the fear persisting or interfering with your enjoyment of our home. Elizabeth appreciated her husband's concern, but remained uncertain whether her reactions constituted normal caution or something more problematic. Only time would tell whether the fear would fade or become a more persistent companion. As they were finishing dinner, the phone rang. Mark answered to find Dan Knowles on the line, his voice animated with news. They caught the bear, Dan reported, without preamble. About 3 miles from your place near the Wilsons' property. Game warden just left here after stopping to let us know. Mark put the call on speaker so Elizabeth could hear. Caught as entrapped? What happens to it now? That's the thing. Dan replied, his tone suggesting mixed feelings. Since it injured a person, Elizabeth, the protocol calls for euthanization. They'll take it to a facility for testing, make sure it doesn't have rabies or other diseases, but the outcome is pretty much predetermined. Elizabeth felt her stomach twist at this news. Despite her fear and the pain of her injury, she had hoped the bear would simply relocate to a more remote area, away from human habitation. The thought of it being killed because of their encounter struck her as deeply unfair. "Is there anything we can do?" she asked. "Could we request they relocate it instead?" "You could try," Dan said, though his tone suggested skepticism. "Call Ranger Alvarez first thing in the morning. But honestly, once they've made the decision, it's usually final. They're concerned about public safety, and a bear that's injured someone is considered too high risk for relocation." After ending the call, Elizabeth sat at the table, her appetite gone as she contemplated the bears. "Fate. It's wrong," she said finally. "It was just being a bear. We were the ones who created the situation by having attractants on our property." Mark sighed, clearly sharing her discomfort with the outcome. "I'll call Alvarez tonight rather than waiting until morning. Maybe there's still a chance to change their minds." The call to Ranger Alvarez confirmed what Dan had told them. The bear, identified as the same one that had been causing problems in the area based on distinctive markings noted by wildlife officers, had been tranquilized and transported to a facility where it would be examined and ultimately euthanized. "I understand your concerns," Alvarez said sympathetically when Elizabeth expressed her objections. "Many people feel conflicted about this outcome, especially when they understand that the bear was just exhibiting natural behaviors. But our policy is clear when human injury is involved. Even if we don't want to press charges or whatever the equivalent would be," Elizabeth asked, grasping at straws. "It feels like punishing the bear for our mistakes." "I appreciate that perspective," Alvarez replied, "but the decision isn't about assigning blame or punishment. It's a matter of risk assessment. Once a bear has had a physical encounter with a human that resulted in injury, the statistical likelihood of future aggressive interactions increases significantly. But the attack wasn't predatory," Mark pointed out. "It was defensive, a response to being startled." "That's true," Alvarez acknowledged, "and in some ways that makes it more concerning from a wildlife management perspective. A bear that readily defaults to defensive aggression when surprised is unpredictable in human-populated areas." The conversation continued for several minutes, but it became increasingly clear that the decision was final. The bear would be euthanized as a precautionary measure, regardless of the circumstances that had led to the encounter or Elizabeth's willingness to advocate for its relocation. After hanging up, Elizabeth moved to the living room window, staring out at the darkening forest with a heavy heart. "I feel responsible," she admitted quietly. "If I hadn't been so oblivious to proper safety measures, if I'd educated myself better about living in bear country." Mark joined her at the window, placing a gentle hand on her uninjured shoulder. "We're both responsible," he corrected. "We moved here, we put up the bird feeders, we didn't secure the compost, but beating ourselves up about it doesn't help anything now." "What does help then?" Elizabeth asked, turning to face him. "Because right now all I feel is guilt and sadness." Mark considered her question thoughtfully. "Maybe the best thing we can do is make sure something positive comes from this. We can share our experience with other residents, especially newcomers to the mountains. We can get involved with wildlife education efforts. We can be better stewards of this place we love." Elizabeth nodded slowly, finding a measure of comfort in his suggestion. They couldn't change the outcome for this particular bear, but perhaps they could help prevent similar situations in the future. The remainder of the evening passed quietly as they each processed the day's events in their own way. Mark made a sagki, few more calls, contacting friends who lived in the area to warn them about the bear activity and share what they'd learned about proper precautions. Elizabeth researched local wildlife conservation groups, looking for opportunities to get involved in community education efforts. As they prepared for bed, Elizabeth found herself drawn once more to the window overlooking the forest. The night was clear, stars visible between the silhouettes of pine trees, the wilderness beautiful and mysterious in the darkness. Somewhere out there, the bear that had changed her life was spending what might be its last night, unaware of the consequences that human policies had dictated for their brief interaction. "It's not fair," she murmured, more to herself than to Mark. "We invade their habitat, then punish them for adapting to our presence." Mark, who had been turning down the bed, paused to join her at the window. "It's the paradox of our relationship with nature," he reflected. "We're drawn to wilderness, to the beauty and authenticity of places like this, but we bring our human needs and fears with us, and we reshape these places to accommodate them." Elizabeth leaned against him, finding comfort in his solid presence. "I still want to live here," she said after a moment. "Despite everything, I just want to do it better, more mindfully." "We will," Mark assured her. This was a harsh lesson, but an effective one. That night, Elizabeth slept more soundly than she had expected, her body's need for healing rest eventually overcoming the churning of her thoughts. She dreamed of the bear not as the frightening creature that had injured her, but as a wild being moving through its natural habitat with purpose and dignity, untroubled by human concerns. Morning brought a renewed sense of purpose. Over breakfast, Elizabeth and Mark outlined a plan for becoming more engaged with wildlife conservation efforts in their community. They would attend the next meeting of the local bear awareness group Dan had mentioned, share their experience, and offer to help educate other residents about proper precautions. "I was thinking I might write something too," Elizabeth said, as she carefully maneuvered her coffee cup with her uninjured hand. "An article for the local paper about our experience, not sensationalized but honest, about the encounter itself and what we've learned from it." Mark nodded approvingly. "That's a great idea. People relate to personal stories far better than to dry lists of do's and don'ts." The phone rang, interrupting their discussion. Mark answered to find Ranger Alvarez on the line, his voice carrying an unexpected note of surprise. "I thought you'd want to know," Alvarez said after exchanging brief greetings. "There's been a development with the bear situation." Elizabeth, who could hear both sides of the conversation with the phone on speaker, felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of development?" she asked. "We've received confirmation from our wildlife pathologist that the bear we captured isn't the one that injured Mrs. Baker," Alvarez explained. "The paw measurements and claw marks don't match the wounds documented at the hospital." "So, the bear that attacked me is still out there?" Elizabeth asked, unsure whether to feel relieved or alarmed by this news. "Most likely yes," Alvarez confirmed, "which means we'll continue monitoring the area. But it also means the bear we captured won't be euthanized. It will be relocated to a more remote region instead." After the call ended, Elizabeth sat in silence for a moment, processing this unexpected turn of events. "I'm glad they're not killing the wrong bear," she finally said, "but I'm not sure how I feel about my bear still being in the area." "They'll probably increase patrols," Mark pointed out, "and we've already taken significant steps to make our property less attractive to bears. The chances of another encounter are extremely low." Elizabeth nodded, trying to take comfort in this logical assessment. "I know. It's just going to take some time for my emotions to catch up with my rational understanding." The remainder of the day passed in relative calm as Elizabeth began drafting her article for the local paper. Writing had always been a therapeutic activity for her, and putting words to her experience helped process the complex emotions that accompanied it. The initial terror, the pain, the guilt over the bear's potential fate, and now the complicated relief of knowing it had not been captured. Mark spent much of the afternoon responding to work emails and catching up on patient files, though he frequently paused to check on Elizabeth or bring her tea. His protective instincts, always present but typically subtle, had shifted into high gear since the bear attack, and while Elizabeth appreciated his attentiveness, she found herself hoping it would moderate over time. She didn't want their relationship dynamics permanently altered by this one incident. Late in the afternoon, as the mountain light began to soften toward evening, Elizabeth stepped onto the deck for the first time since the attack. It was a deliberate choice, a small act of reclamation. She stood at the railing, her bandaged arm cradled against her body, and looked out at the familiar landscape that had briefly become threatening. The view remained as beautiful as ever, pine-clad slopes rising toward distant peaks, wildflowers dotting the clearing near the tree line, birds darting among the branches. This was why they had moved here, for this connection to the natural world, this sense of being part of something larger and more enduring than human concerns. Mark found her there a few minutes later, silently joining her at the railing. "Doing okay?" he asked softly. Elizabeth nodded. "I think so. Just reminding myself why we chose this place. Second thoughts?" "No," she said after a moment's reflection. "Deeper thoughts, maybe, about what it really means to live here, in this ecosystem. How to do it respectfully and safely." They stood together as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across their property. In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled lazily on thermals, its hunt unhurried in the golden light of approaching sunset. "I keep thinking about the bear," Elizabeth admitted. "Where it is now, what it's doing, whether it learned anything from our encounter." "Bears are intelligent," Mark replied. "They remember negative experiences and often avoid the locations where they occurred. There's a good chance it's found a new territory far from here. Elizabeth hoped he was right, both for their safety and for the bears. She wanted it to live out its natural life in the wilderness, far from the complicated intersection of human and animal worlds that had led to their brief, violent encounter. As darkness began to settle over the mountains, they returned inside, closing and carefully locking the door behind them, a precaution they had sometimes neglected before, but would likely never forget again. The cabin felt different now, not just because of the new security measures, but because their perception of their place within this environment had fundamentally shifted. They were visitors here, temporary residents in a landscape that belonged primarily to the wild creatures who had inhabited it long before human development reached the mountains. That awareness didn't diminish their right to live here, but it did impose a responsibility to do so with respect and caution. The next morning brought a follow-up appointment at the hospital for Elizabeth's wound check. Dr. Reyes examined the lacerations carefully, nodding with satisfaction at their appearance. "These are healing well," she pronounced. "No signs of infection, and the edges are coming together nicely. You'll need to continue the antibiotics for the full course, and the stitches will stay in for about 10 days, but I'm pleased with your progress." "Will I need physical therapy?" Elizabeth asked, remembering Carol Henderson's comment about the lengthy recovery of another bear attack victim. "I don't think so," Dr. Reyes replied. "The muscles weren't significantly damaged, and you should regain full function naturally as the wounds heal. Just be mindful of not overtaxing the arm in the next few weeks, and gradually increase activity as the pain subsides." On the drive home, they stopped at the offices of the Mountain Gazette, the local newspaper that served several communities in the area. Elizabeth had called ahead to inquire about submitting her article, and the editor, a jovial man named Pete Sanderson, had invited her to drop by in person. Sanderson greeted them warmly, his interest peaking visibly when Elizabeth explained the nature of her submission. "A first-hand bear encounter story. That's exactly the kind of local content our readers value," he said enthusiastically, "especially with an educational angle rather than just sensationalism." Elizabeth handed him a printed copy of her article, watching anxiously as he skimmed the first few paragraphs. She had titled it, "Lessons from a Bear Encounter, What I Wish I'd Known Before Moving to the Mountains," and had tried to balance the narrative of her experience with practical information about bear safety and prevention. "This is good," Sanderson said, looking up with approval. "Very good, actually. Would you be willing to let us take a photo to accompany the piece, maybe at your property, with your bandaged arm visible? Nothing exploitative, just something to make the story more immediate for readers." Elizabeth hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of being photographed specifically because of her injury. "I'd prefer to keep the focus on the educational aspects rather than on me personally," she said carefully. "Perhaps a stock photo of a black bear would be more appropriate." Sanderson looked disappointed but nodded understanding. "So of course, that's your choice. We can certainly use a generic bear image instead." He set the article aside on his desk. "We'll run this in next Wednesday's edition. It's exactly the kind of community education piece we like to feature." As they left the newspaper office, Elizabeth felt a small sense of accomplishment. Her experience, painful and frightening though it had been, might help others avoid similar situations. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was something positive emerging from the encounter. The remainder of the day passed quietly. As they settled back into a semblance of their normal routine, Mark caught up on work emails while Elizabeth rested on the deck, her arm elevated on a cushion as she watched birds at the newly installed birdhouse that had replaced their feeders, a bear-safe alternative that Ranger Alvarez had recommended. Around mid-afternoon, a wildlife department vehicle pulled into their driveway. Elizabeth recognized Ranger Alvarez as he stepped out and waved in greeting. "Just thought I'd stop by to see how you're doing," he explained as he climbed the steps to the deck. "And to let you know we've been monitoring the area closely. No further bear sightings near your property in the past 48 hours. "That's reassuring," Elizabeth said, gesturing for him to take a seat in one of the Adirondack chairs. "We've implemented pretty much all the safety measures you recommended. The place is practically a fortress against wildlife now." Alvarez smiled approvingly as he sat. "I noticed the new trash containers and the removal of the bird feeders. Those are the two most important steps. Bear-proof trash cans have been shown to reduce human-bear conflicts by over 60% in some communities." "What about the bear you originally captured?" Mark asked, joining them on the deck. "The one that wasn't responsible for attacking Elizabeth? Successfully relocated to a more remote area about 70 miles from here," Alvarez reported. We fitted it with a tracking collar before release, so we'll be able to monitor its movements and ensure it doesn't return to developed areas. Elizabeth felt a surge of relief at this news. At least one bear had been spared the consequences of human-wildlife conflict. "And the one that attacked me?" she asked. "Will you continue trying to capture it?" Alvarez's expression turned more serious. "We'll maintain increased monitoring in this area, but without additional incidents, a capture operation is unlikely. Resources are limited, and we have to prioritize active threats." "So it just goes on with its life, as if nothing happened," Elizabeth mused, not entirely sure how she felt about this outcome. "Nature doesn't operate according to human notions of justice or accountability," Alvarez said thoughtfully. "Bears don't hold grudges or seek revenge, but they do learn from experiences. Your encounter likely taught that bear that humans can be dangerous, which might actually make it less likely to approach people in the future." The conversation shifted to broader wildlife management issues in the region, with Alvarez sharing insights from his 15 years of experience with Colorado parks and wildlife. Elizabeth found his perspective fascinating, a complex balance of scientific understanding, practical resource limitations, and genuine care for both wildlife and the human communities that shared their habitat. "The biggest challenge we face isn't actually problem bears," Alvarez explained. "It's helping people understand that they're living in bear country and need to adapt their behaviors accordingly. Most human-bear conflicts are preventable with proper precautions." "That's what I tried to emphasize in the article I wrote for the local paper," Elizabeth said, "that we need to take responsibility for creating safe coexistence rather than expecting wildlife to accommodate our presence." Alvarez nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the message we try to promote. I'd be interested in reading your article when it's published." By the time Ranger Alvarez departed, Elizabeth felt a growing sense of peace about the situation. The encounter with the bear, while traumatic, had initiated a deeper understanding of what it meant to live responsibly in this environment. It was a painful lesson, certainly, but perhaps a necessary one for their transition from urban to mountain living. The following days fell into a new pattern as Elizabeth's arm began to heal and her confidence in their safety measures increased. She ventured into the garden again, though never without first scanning the tree line carefully and making noise to alert any wildlife to her presence. Mark returned to work at the clinic, initially reluctant to leave her alone, but eventually reassured by her increasing comfort with their new normal. A week after the attack, Elizabeth received a call from Pete Sanderson at the Mountain Gazette, informing her that her article would be featured on the front page of the upcoming edition rather than buried in the interior as originally planned. "We've had several bear incidents reported in the past few days," Sanderson explained. "Nothing involving injuries, thankfully, but property damage and sightings in residential areas. Your timing couldn't be better." Elizabeth felt a renewed sense of purpose at this news. Perhaps her experience would help others avoid similar encounters or worse attacks. It wasn't what she had envisioned when they'd moved to the mountains, but it was a meaningful contribution to their community nonetheless. The article was published on Wednesday as promised, prominently displayed on the front page beneath a generic stock photo of a black bear. Elizabeth felt a strange mix of vulnerability and pride seeing her name in print, her private experience, now shared with the entire community. Mark bought several copies, proudly showing one to every patient who entered his examination room that day. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. By Wednesday afternoon, Elizabeth had received calls from several neighbors she'd never met, thanking her for sharing her story and asking questions about specific bear-proofing measures. The president of the local homeowners association invited her to speak at their next meeting about wildlife safety, and Ranger Alvarez left a voicemail complimenting the balanced, educational approach she'd taken in the article. "You've turned a negative experience into a valuable community resource," Dan Knowles told her when he and Sarah stopped by on Wednesday evening. "That's pretty admirable, especially considering you're still dealing with the physical aftermath." Elizabeth glanced down at her bandaged arm, which continued to throb occasionally despite the pain medication. The doctor had assured her the wounds were healing well, but complete recovery would take time. "It seemed like the best way to make something constructive out of the situation," she replied, "and it's been therapeutic to process it through writing." The conversation with the Knowleses drifted to local news and community events, and Elizabeth found herself more engaged than she had been in previous social interactions since moving to the mountains. Something about the shared understanding of the wilderness surrounding them, its beauty and its dangers, created a deeper connection with these neighbors who had experienced similar adjustments to mountain living. Later that night, As Elizabeth stood at the bedroom window looking out at the moonlit forest, she reflected on how much had changed in the span of just over a week. The bear encounter had been frightening and painful, leaving physical scars that would remain with her for life. But it had also catalyzed a transformation in how she related to this place they had chosen as home. The romantic idealism that had colored her initial perception of mountain living had been replaced by something more grounded and ultimately more meaningful, a respect for the wild creatures whose territory they shared, an awareness of the responsibility that came with living in this environment, and a deeper connection to the community of people who had made similar choices. Mark joined her at the window, slipping an arm gently around her waist. "Penny, for your thoughts." "Just thinking about how much has changed," she replied, leaning against him. "Not just the bear-proofing and security measures, but how I see this place now. For better or worse?" he asked quietly. Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "Different," she finally said. "More complex. Less idealized but more authentic. I still love it here, maybe even more now that I understand it better." Mark nodded, seeming to understand exactly what she meant. The mountains aren't just a pretty view or an escape from city life. They're a whole ecosystem that we've chosen to become part of, with all the beauty and challenges that entails. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the gentle movement of pine branches in the night breeze. Somewhere in the darkness beyond their property, the bear that had altered Elizabeth's life continued its own existence, following ancient instincts in a world increasingly shaped by human presence. Elizabeth hoped it had found a safer territory, far from the complicated boundary where wilderness and civilization met, but she also recognized that their paths might cross again someday, despite all precautions. That was the reality of the choice they had made, to live not apart from nature but within it, accepting both its gifts and its hazards. 2 days later, as Elizabeth sat on the deck enjoying her morning coffee, movement at the edge of the forest caught her attention. She tensed instinctively, reaching for the air horn they now kept beside the door, but relaxed as a family of deer emerged from the trees, a doe and 2 speckled fawns picking their delicate way across the clearing. The sight brought a smile to her face. This was why they had chosen this place, for moments like this, connections to a world that operated according to rhythms far older than human concerns. The bear encounter had shaken her sense of security, but it hadn't diminished her appreciation for the wilderness that surrounded them. As if sensing her thoughts, the doe lifted her head, ears swiveling toward the deck where Elizabeth sat. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, wild animal and human observer acknowledging each other's presence in a shared landscape. Then the deer returned to browsing, apparently deciding that the human posed no immediate threat. Elizabeth sipped her coffee, content to watch the small family as they grazed their way across the property. The arm beneath her bandages itched. As the wounds continued to heal, a physical reminder of the thin line between appreciation of wilderness and respect for its dangers. Inside, the phone rang, and Mark appeared at the door a moment later. "It's Carol Henderson," he said, holding out the cordless handset. "Wanted to know if you're up for a short hike this weekend. Apparently, there's a women's group that does regular outings focused on wildlife awareness and safety." Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before accepting the phone. "Hi, Carol," she said warmly. "A hike sounds wonderful, actually. I could use some guided practice getting comfortable in the woods." Again, as she made arrangements to join the weekend excursion, Elizabeth realized that her relationship with the mountains was entering yet another phase. Not the naive enthusiasm of their first years here, nor the fearful withdrawal that had followed the bear attack, but something more balanced and sustainable. A respect-filled coexistence that acknowledged both the majesty and the potential dangers of the natural world. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its westward descent toward the peaks, Elizabeth ventured alone to the vegetable garden for the first time since the attack. The tomato seedlings had suffered from neglect during her recovery, but most had survived. She knelt carefully beside the raised bed, mindful of her healing arm, and began gently removing weeds from around the young plants. The forest beyond the garden remained still and peaceful, offering no hint of danger. Yet Elizabeth maintained a new awareness of her surroundings, periodically glancing up to scan the tree line, occasionally making small noises to announce her presence to any wildlife that might be near. Not out of paralyzing fear, but out of a newfound respect for the wild neighbors with whom they shared this mountain. As she worked, Elizabeth found herself oddly grateful for the encounter that had so dramatically altered her perspective. The bear had been following its nature, seeking food in a habitat increasingly encroached upon by human development. She had been following her own nature, creating a home in a landscape she loved without fully understanding its complexities. Their brief, violent intersection had left its mark on her body and psyche, but it had also initiated a deeper, more authentic relationship with this place, one based not on romanticized notions of wilderness, but on the complex reality of human wildlife coexistence. The scars on her arm would remain as permanent reminders of that lesson, badges of her evolution, from newcomer to true mountain resident. In the forest miles away, the black bear that had encountered Elizabeth continued its own journey through the wilderness. It moved with the characteristic rolling gait of its species, nose lifted to sample the air, following ancient instincts in a landscape increasingly fragmented by human presence. The brief interaction with the human female had been just one moment in its existence, quickly overshadowed by the more pressing concerns of survival in a changing world. The bear paused at the edge of a small stream, lowering its head to drink from the clear mountain water. Then it continued on its way, disappearing into the dense undergrowth of the forest, a wild creature moving through its natural habitat, unconcerned with the profound impact it had left on one human life, carrying no memory of the encounter. Beyond an instinctive wariness of the scents and sounds associated with human dwellings. Elizabeth would never know this, of course. She would never see the bear again, never learn its ultimate fate. But as she tended her garden in the shadow of the mountains, she felt a curious connection to the creature that had altered her perception so dramatically, a shared participation in the complex ecosystem they both inhabited, bound together by a brief, violent intersection of their separate worlds. And in that connection, despite the pain and fear it had entailed, she found an unexpected peace, a more grounded understanding of her place in the wilderness she had chosen as home. The morning air carried a crisp chill as Mark Stevens loaded the last of his gear into his weathered Subaru Outback. The digital display on his dashboard read 5:47 a.m., earlier than he typically rose, even for work, but today was different. Today marked the beginning of the kayaking trip he and his best friend Jason Miller had been planning for the past 6 months. The Flathead River in northwestern Montana had been on their bucket list for years, its reputation for pristine waters and challenging rapids drawing adventure seekers from across the country. At 42, Mark had been kayaking for over 2 decades, but the Flathead would be a new conquest, a welcome challenge after the monotony of his accounting job in Bozeman. He took a final inventory of his equipment, his trusty lime green Dagger Phantom kayak secured to the roof rack, paddle broken down and stored safely in its bag, PFD helmet, dry bags containing clothes and camping gear, first aid kit, GPS device, satellite phone for emergencies, and, crucially for Montana's wilderness, a canister of bear spray attached to his belt. Mark had grown up in Montana, spent countless hours in the backcountry and knew the protocols. He'd seen black bears a handful of times over the years, always from a distance, and had never encountered a grizzly. Still, preparation was second nature to him. The 20-minute drive to Jason's house passed in contemplative silence, the radio off as Mark mentally traced their planned route down the middle fork of the Flathead River. They would put in near West Glacier and paddle approximately 18 miles over 2 days, camping overnight on a sandbar. The section featured Class 2 and 3 rapids, challenging enough to be exciting but well within their skill level. Mark had studied river reports, checked weather forecasts, and knew the water levels were ideal. Late June brought swift currents from snowmelt, but nothing beyond their capabilities. Jason emerged from his front door before Mark could even honk, his broad grin visible in the early morning light. At 38, Jason was the more athletic of the pair, with the lean build of someone who spent most weekends climbing, hiking, or paddling. The outdoor education teacher had been Mark's kayaking companion since they met on a group trip 7 years ago, and their compatible personalities and mutual respect for river safety made them ideal paddling partners. "Morning, River Rat," Jason called, tossing his backpack into the Subaru's trunk. "Perfect day for it, huh?" Mark nodded, helping Jason secure his red Piranha kayak alongside his own on the roof rack. "Couldn't have asked for better. Forecast says clear skies, high of 75. And the water level? Ideal. Fast, but not dangerous. We'll have to portage around Bone Crusher Rapids, but otherwise, we should be able to paddle the whole stretch." The drive to West Glacier took just under 3 hours, the early morning light gradually illuminating the spectacular Montana landscape. Jagged mountain peaks pierced the horizon, their slopes draped in dense conifer forests. Mark and Jason filled the drive with comfortable conversation, reviewing their route one final time and reminiscing about previous adventures. Remember that bull moose on the Gallatin last year? Jason laughed. I've never seen you paddle backward so fast. Mark chuckled. Better than being trampled. Wildlife encounters are only fun from a safe distance. Speaking of which, Jason said, his tone shifting slightly, I read that grizzly sightings are up this year in Glacier. Something about a poor berry crop pushing them to lower elevations. Mark's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Yeah, I saw that report. That's why I double-checked that both our bear sprays are current. Not expired, full canisters. Good man, though I'd prefer to appreciate the bears from very, very far away. Or not at all, Mark added. They arrived at the put-in point near West Glacier just after 9 a.m. The small gravel lot already held 3 other vehicles, likely belonging to fishermen or day trippers. Mark and Jason efficiently unloaded their gear, double-checking every item before locking the car and hiding the key in their predetermined spot under a specific rock near the trailhead signpost. They'd retrieved the vehicle when Jason's wife, Layla, dropped them at this same spot after picking them up at their takeout point tomorrow. The air hummed with anticipation as they carried their kayaks down to the water's edge. The middle fork of the Flathead River stretched before them, its surface glinting in the morning sun. The water ran clear and swift over a bed of multicolored rocks, the distant roar of small rapids promising excitement ahead. God, I needed this, Mark said, surveying the scene. The office felt a million miles away. Here the only deadlines were those imposed by daylight. The only metrics that mattered were river flow and miles traveled. They performed their standard safety checks, adjusting spray skirts and helmet straps, securing dry bags, and reviewing hand signals for river communication. Both men wore quick-dry shirts and shorts over their wetsuits. The June air was warm, but the snowmelt-fed river remained cold enough to pose a hypothermia risk in case of prolonged immersion. Ready to crush this? Jason asked, adjusting his mirrored sunglasses. Mark grinned and nodded. Let's do it. Their kayaks sliced into the clear water with barely a sound, the current immediately catching them in its embrace. The first mile passed in peaceful gliding, both men finding their rhythm as they adjusted to the river's flow. Mark felt the familiar sense of freedom that always came on the water, his body responding instinctively to the river's movements, paddle dipping smoothly to make minor course corrections. The middle fork widened and narrowed as it wound through the spectacular terrain, bordered by steep forested slopes that occasionally gave way to rocky cliffs. They passed a group of fly fishermen, exchanging friendly waves, and spotted a bald eagle soaring overhead, its white head gleaming against the azure sky. The first set of rapids appeared just before 11 a.m., a straightforward Class 2 that presented little challenge. Mark and Jason navigated it with practiced ease, reading the water's surface for signs of submerged rocks, using the current's power to propel them through the churning water. Smooth as silk, Jason called as they emerged from the whitewater, both kayaks bobbing like corks in the calmer pool below. They stopped for lunch around noon on a sunny gravel bar, stretching their legs and refueling with sandwiches and trail mix. Mark spread out their waterproof map, tracing their progress with his finger. We're making good time, he said. Another few hours of paddling, and we'll reach our campsite. Should hit Bone Crusher around 3, I'm guessing. Jason nodded, scanning the shoreline with a practiced eye. Seen any tracks yet? Mark knew he meant bear signs. Nothing so far, but we're still close to the road. It'll get more remote as we go. They packed up after 30 minutes, eager to continue. The river grew, gradually more challenging throughout the afternoon, the rapids more frequent and technically demanding. Mark felt his focus sharpen, the rest of the world falling away as he read the water, anticipating the push and pull of currents, the hidden obstacles beneath the surface. This was what he lived for, these moments of pure presence, when nothing existed except the river and his response to it. By mid-afternoon, the sound of rushing water grew louder ahead, signaling their approach to Bone Crusher Rapids. Named for its boat-destroying potential, this Class 4 rapid featured a narrow chute between massive boulders, followed by a 6-foot drop and a churning hydraulic that could trap and recirculate boats and swimmers. It lay beyond their skill, level, and comfort zone, a deliberate portage point they'd agreed upon during planning. "Eddie on the right," Jason called from his lead position, already angling his red kayak toward the calmer water near the shore. Mark followed, paddling hard, to escape the main current and glide into the eddy. They beached their kayaks on a small rocky shore about 100 yards upstream from where Bone Crusher began. The roar of the rapids echoed through the canyon, a constant reminder of the river's power. "Quite a beast," Jason remarked, peering downstream at the white water churning between massive boulders. Mark nodded, removing his spray skirt and extracting himself from his kayak. His legs felt slightly wobbly from hours of sitting, a sensation familiar to any kayaker. Definitely worth the portage. I don't fancy swimming that stretch. They began the process of carrying their boats and gear along the narrow trail that paralleled the rapids. The path was rough and uneven, winding through dense undergrowth and over fallen logs. Mark went first, his lime green kayak balanced expertly on his right shoulder, paddle strapped to its deck. Jason followed about 20 yards behind, giving Mark space to navigate the difficult terrain. The trail narrowed as it curved around a large boulder, forcing Mark to angle his kayak carefully to avoid scraping it against the rock face. Focused on this maneuver, he rounded the corner and froze mid-step. Not 15 feet ahead, a massive grizzly bear stood in the middle of the trail. Time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously. Mark's brain registered details with preternatural clarity, the distinctive shoulder hump identifying it as a grizzly rather than a black bear, the massive head with its dish-shaped profile, the shaggy coat ranging from dark brown to almost blonde at the tips, the massive paws with claws that could disembowel a moose. The bear was enormous, at least 600 pounds, Mark guessed, and stood casually on all fours, its head raised as it became aware of his presence. Mark's mouth went dry, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every wilderness safety lesson he'd ever learned flashed through his mind in a chaotic jumble. Don't run, speak calmly, appear non-threatening, back away slowly. If it charges, play dead. If it attacks, fight back. But which applied now? His hand instinctively moved toward the bear spray canister on his belt, but the movement was painfully slow, as if he were underwater. The grizzly's small eyes fixed on him, its nostrils flaring as it sampled his scent. For one eternal moment, bear and man stared at each other, two species sharing the same space, but separated by an unbridgeable evolutionary gulf. Behind him, Jason remained out of sight around the boulder, unaware of the confrontation unfolding. "Bear," Mark finally managed to call, his voice emerging as little more than a strangled whisper. He tried again, louder. "Bear, Jason, there's a bear!" The grizzly's ears flicked forward at the sound, its powerful shoulders tensing. Mark began to back up slowly, keeping his eyes on the bear while trying not to appear challenging. The kayak on his shoulder suddenly felt impossibly unwieldy, throwing off his balance and restricting his movement. "I'm just passing through," he said, in what he hoped was a calm, reassuring tone. "Not here to bother you." The bear huffed, a deep rumbling sound that Mark felt in his chest. It took a deliberate step forward, head swinging from side to side in the distinctive movement bears use to better capture scents. Mark continued his careful retreat, his mind racing through options. Should he drop the kayak, it would create a barrier between him and the bear, but the sudden movement might trigger a predatory response. Should he try to reach his bear spray? The canister was within reach, but accessing it would require shifting his position. "Mark?" Jason's voice came from around the bend. "What's going? Stay back," Mark hissed urgently. "Grizzly on the trail. Get your spray ready." The bear rose onto its hind legs at the sound of the second voice, now towering nearly 8 feet tall. It opened its mouth, revealing yellowed canines the size of Mark's fingers, and let out a low growl that seemed to vibrate the air itself. Mark's retreat became more urgent, his feet searching blindly for secure placement on the rocky trail. One step, then another. The weight of the kayak threw him slightly off balance with each backward movement. Then his heel caught on an exposed tree root. The world tilted. Mark felt himself falling before he could compensate, the kayak's weight pulling him sideways. He crashed onto the rocky trail, the kayak clattering beside him. Pain shot through his elbow where it struck the ground, but that was the least of his concerns. The sudden movement and noise acted like a trigger. The grizzly dropped to all fours and charged. Everything Mark had ever learned about bear encounters evaporated in the face of 600 pounds of muscle and claw hurtling toward him at 30 miles per hour. Instinct took over. He scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the oncoming predator, his hands and feet slipping on the loose stones of the trail. "Mark!" Jason's shout barely registered. The bear closed the distance in seconds. Mark had just enough time to curl into a protective ball, hands locked behind his neck, face pressed against the ground, when the first blow landed. The grizzly's paw struck his left shoulder with devastating force, the claws shredding through his shirt and wetsuit like tissue paper, tearing into the flesh beneath. White-hot pain exploded across Mark's consciousness. The bear's breath, hot and rank with the smell of carrion, engulfed him as massive jaws closed around his upper arm. Teeth designed for crushing roots and pine cones easily punched through muscle and scraped bone. Mark's world collapsed to a pinpoint of agony and terror. Somewhere distant, he heard screaming and realized it was his own voice, torn from his throat by primal fear. The bear shook its massive head, treating Mark's arm like a dog with a chew toy, the movement threatening to dislocate his shoulder. "Hey! Hey!" Jason's voice penetrated the chaos, followed by a distinctive hissing sound. Suddenly, the crushing pressure on Mark's arm released. The bear reared back, pawing at its face and snorting violently. The acrid smell of pepper spray cut through the air as the wind carried a thin mist of it toward Mark, stinging his eyes and nostrils. "Mark, don't move!" Jason shouted, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Play dead! I'm right here!" Mark remained motionless, curled tightly against the ground, blood pulsing from the wounds in his shoulder and arm. Through slitted eyes, he watched the grizzly stagger backward, shaking, its massive head and blowing forcefully through its nostrils, trying to clear the capsaicin from its sensitive mucous membranes. Jason stood his ground about 10 yards away, the bear spray canister still raised, ready for a second deployment if necessary. "That's right, get out of here," he called, his voice steady despite the tremor Mark could detect beneath the words. The bear huffed and woofed, clearly agitated, but rapidly losing interest in the encounter now that pain had replaced predatory focus. It turned in a half circle, still rubbing its face against the ground, then looked back once at the humans who had caused its discomfort. With a final dismissive huff, it lumbered off the trail and into the underbrush, breaking branches and rustling vegetation as it retreated. Only when the sounds had faded did Jason rush to Mark's side, dropping to his knees on the blood-spattered trail. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, surveying the damage. "Mark, can you hear me?" Mark uncurled slightly, wincing as fresh waves of pain washed over him. "Yeah," he managed, his voice weak and shaky. "Is it gone?" "It's gone." Bear spray worked. Jason was already rummaging in his PFD pocket for the compact first aid kit they each carried. "I need to see how bad it is." Mark nodded, gritting his teeth as Jason carefully cut away the shredded fabric from his left shoulder and arm. The cool air on the exposed wounds brought fresh pain, drawing a hiss through Mark's clenched teeth. "It's pretty bad," Jason said, his voice carefully controlled. "Deep lacerations on your shoulder, puncture wounds on your arm, bleeding heavily but no arterial spurting, thank God." He pulled out gauze pads and began applying direct pressure to the worst of the wounds. "This is beyond our first aid capabilities, buddy. We need to get you to a hospital ASAP." Mark nodded weakly, shock beginning to set in. His extremities felt cold and tingly, his thoughts becoming sluggish. "Satellite phone," he murmured. "In my front dry bag." Jason worked efficiently, years of wilderness first aid training kicking in. He applied pressure dressings to the worst of the wounds, using all the gauze from both their first aid kits and securing them with athletic tape. Then he retrieved the satellite phone from Mark's kayak, his hands leaving bloody smudges on the waterproof case. "Wilderness Emergency Services, what is your situation?" The operator's voice sounded tinny and distant through the satellite connection. "This is Jason Miller. My friend and I were kayaking the middle fork of the Flathead River. We're at the portage trail around Bone Crusher Rapids. My friend has been attacked by a grizzly bear and has severe lacerations and puncture wounds to his left shoulder and arm. He's conscious but losing blood. We need immediate medical evacuation." Mark drifted in and out of full awareness as Jason relayed their coordinates from the GPS device. The pain had transformed from sharp and immediate to a deep throbbing presence, strangely distant. He recognized the dangerous comfort of shock, forcing himself to focus on his breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. To stay conscious. "They're sending a helicopter," Jason reported, returning to Mark's side. "ETA 30 minutes. They've also notified park rangers, who will approach by river. We just need to hang tight." He knelt beside Mark, checking the dressings, which were already soaking through with blood. "I'm going to elevate your legs, okay? Help keep your blood pressure up." Mark nodded weakly. "Thanks for the bear spray." Jason managed a tight smile. "Good thing we checked the expiration dates, huh?" The next half hour stretched into what felt like days. Jason maintained constant pressure on the wounds, replacing soaked gauze with clean bandanas from their gear when necessary. He kept up a steady stream of conversation, forcing Mark to respond, keeping him from slipping too deeply into shock. "Remember that time on the Snake River when you flipped 3 times in one rapid?" Jason asked, his voice deliberately light despite the tension in his face. Mark's lips curved in a weak smile. "You wouldn't let me forget, and I never will. Just like you won't let me forget about the time I got my boat pinned on that rock. In the Gallatin, what did you call me?" "River Hazard," Mark whispered. "That's right, River Hazard Miller, creating strainers one kayak at a time." The distant thump, thump, thump of helicopter blades finally cut through the air, growing louder. As the rescue chopper approached, Jason pulled out his emergency whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts, the universal signal for help, then waved his bright red PFD over his head when the helicopter appeared above the river canyon. The pilot spotted them quickly, hovering as close as the narrow canyon allowed. A rescue paramedic was lowered on a cable, touching down lightly on the trail near them. Medical kit already in hand. "I'm Devon," the paramedic shouted over the rotor noise. "Bear attack, right?" Jason nodded, moving aside to give the professional access to Mark. "Grizzly. About 30 minutes ago, he's lost a lot of blood." Devon worked with practiced efficiency, cutting away more clothing to fully expose the wounds, inserting an IV line for fluid replacement, administering pain medication that finally took the edge off Mark's agony. He applied fresh, proper pressure dressings, then secured Mark to a rescue stretcher. "We're going to lift you up first," Devon explained to Mark, his voice calm and reassuring. "Your friend will be brought up after. We'll fly you directly to Kalispell Regional Medical Center. It's about a 15-minute flight." Mark managed a nod, then looked at Jason. "My kayak." "Don't worry about the gear," Jason said firmly. "I'll handle it. Rangers are on their way. Just focus on staying alive, okay?" The ascent into the helicopter passed in a blur of pain and vertigo. Mark focused on the blue sky above him, trying to control his breathing as the ground fell away. Inside the helicopter, a second paramedic continued treatment, attaching monitors that beeped with reassuring regularity. "BP's low but stable," she reported to Devon as he was winched up with Jason. "Significant blood loss but no signs of arterial damage. Multiple deep lacerations and puncture wounds left shoulder and upper arm. Probable tendon and muscle damage. No obvious fractures." Mark drifted in and out of awareness during the flight, the pain medication creating a strange detachment from both his body and the situation. Faces appeared above him, spoke words he couldn't quite grasp, performed actions he observed with clinical detachment. The helicopter's vibration hummed through his body, almost soothing in its constancy. The landing at Kalispell Regional Medical Center jolted him back to sharper awareness. Suddenly there was movement, urgency, a rush of new faces and voices as he was transferred from the helicopter to a gurney and wheeled rapidly into the emergency department. 42-year-old male grizzly bear attack approximately 1 hour. "Fair go," Devon reported to the receiving trauma team. "Multiple deep lacerations and puncture wounds to left shoulder and upper arm. Significant blood loss, pressure 90/60, heart rate 110 and regular. 2 liters normal saline infusing, 5 mg morphine, administered in field." The emergency room exploded into controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses swarmed around Mark, cutting away the remaining clothing, inserting additional IV lines, drawing blood samples, attaching monitors. A bright light shone into his eyes as someone checked his pupillary response. "Mr. Stevens, can you hear me?" A female doctor with short gray hair leaned into his field of vision. "I'm Dr. Wilkins, the trauma surgeon on call. You've been attacked by a bear and we're going to take care of your injuries. Do you understand?" Mark managed a weak nod. "Good. We're going to need to take you to surgery to clean and repair these wounds. Are you allergic to any medications?" "No," Mark whispered. "Any medical conditions we should know about?" He shook his head slightly. "Do you know when you last had a tetanus shot?" 3 years ago, Mark managed. "Stepped on a nail," Dr. Wilkins nodded. "Perfect. We're going to take good care of you, Mr. Stevens." An anesthesiologist appeared at Mark's other side, explaining the sedation process in a calm, measured voice. Mark felt a cold sensation in his arm as new medication entered his IV, and then the world began to fade around the edges, the lights above him blurring and merging until darkness claimed him entirely. Mark drifted back to consciousness slowly, awareness returning in disconnected fragments. First came the sounds, the steady beep of monitors, the murmur of distant voices, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. Then sensations, the scratch of hospital sheets against his skin, the pressure of bandages across his shoulder and down his arm, the dry thickness of his tongue. Finally, when he managed to open his eyes, came the sight of a hospital room, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. A nurse noticed his return to consciousness immediately, approaching the bed with a professional smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Stevens. How's your pain level on a scale of 1 to 10? Mark considered the question, taking inventory of his body. His left shoulder and arm throbbed with a deep, persistent ache, but the sharp, tearing pain from the trail was gone, blunted by what he assumed were significant painkillers. 4. he croaked, his throat dry and scratchy. "That's good," the nurse replied, checking his IV lines and monitors. "Dr. Wilkins will be in shortly to discuss your surgery. You've been out for about 3 hours." 3 hours? Mark tried to process this information through the fog of anesthesia and pain medication. "Jason?" he asked. "My friend? He's in the waiting room. Once Dr. Wilkins examines you, we can let him in for a short visit." She offered him a cup of water with a straw. Small sips only for now. The cool water was blissful on his parched throat. Before he could ask more questions, Dr. Wilkins entered the room, chart in hand. "Mr. Stevens, good to see you awake," she said, approaching the bed. "The surgery went very well. The bear did significant damage to your trapezius and deltoid muscles, and there were several deep puncture wounds from its teeth, but fortunately it missed major blood vessels and nerves. We've irrigated and debrided all the wounds, removed some damaged tissue and repaired what we could. You'll need extensive physical therapy, but I expect you to regain most, if not all, function in that arm and shoulder eventually." Mark nodded, slowly, trying to absorb the information. "How long until I can use it normally again?" "Full recovery will take time, 6 to 8 weeks before the tissue is fully healed, and possibly several months of physical therapy after that to regain full strength and range of motion." Dr. Wilkins' expression was compassionate but frank. "Bear attacks cause complex wounds, crushing damage combined with lacerations and punctures. The risk of infection is significant, so we've started you on broad-spectrum antibiotics and rabies prophylaxis as a precaution." Rabies? Mark hadn't considered that possibility. It's standard protocol after wild animal attacks, especially when we can't observe the animal. Rabies is rare in bears, but the treatment is preventative. She made some notes in his chart. "We'll keep you here for at least 3 days to monitor for infection and manage your pain. After that, you'll need follow-up appointments for wound checks and to remove sutures. The plastic surgery team was consulted during your operation, but you will have significant scarring." The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. Mark would carry visible reminders of this encounter for the rest of his life, written in scar tissue across his shoulder and arm. "Can I see Jason now?" he asked. Dr. Wilkins nodded. "Yes, but keep the visit brief. You need rest." She patted his uninjured right arm gently. "You're very lucky, Mr. Stevens. That bear could have done much worse." The doctor departed, and a few minutes later, Jason entered the room, his face breaking into a relieved smile when he saw Mark awake. "You look like hell," he said, the lightness of his tone belied by the emotion in his eyes. "Thanks," Mark replied with a weak smile. "Feel like it too." Jason pulled a chair close to the bed. "They said the surgery went well." "Yeah, no major vessel or nerve damage, just mangled muscles and a lot of punctures." Mark swallowed hard. "Jason, if you hadn't been there with that bear spray—" "Don't even go there," Jason cut him off. "You'd have done the same for me." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of how differently things could have ended. "What happened with our gear?" Mark finally asked. "Park rangers showed up about 10 minutes after the helicopter left. They took statements, documented the scene, collected samples of the bear's fur from where it happened." Jason's voice wavered slightly. "They're storing our kayaks and gear at the ranger station. Layla's on her way, should be here in a couple hours. She'll drive me back to get your car tomorrow." Mark nodded gratefully. "The rangers, are they going to track the bear?" "They said they'll investigate, but unless it shows a pattern of aggression toward humans, they probably won't euthanize it. We were in its territory after all, and it just reacted." Jason looked down at his hands. "They said the pepper spray likely taught it a good lesson about humans being more trouble than they're worth." The reality that the bear was still out there, possibly within a few miles of where they'd planned to camp tonight, sent a chill through Mark that had nothing to do with hospital air conditioning. "I filled out an incident report," Jason continued. "They'll want your statement too when you're up for it. One of the rangers is coming by tomorrow." The nurse returned, gently indicating that Mark needed rest. Jason stood, squeezing Mark's right hand carefully. "I'll be back in the morning. Need me to call anyone for you?" Mark thought of his ex-wife in Seattle, his parents in Florida, his sister in Chicago. "Not yet. Let me get through the night first. I'll make some calls tomorrow." After Jason left, Mark found himself alone with the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the muted hospital sounds filtering through his closed door. The pain medication kept discomfort at a manageable level, but did nothing for the mental replay of the attack that began the moment quiet descended. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the grizzly rising on its hind legs, smelled its carrion breath, felt its crushing jaws on his arm. A different nurse came in to check his vitals and administer another dose of pain medication. The powerful drugs pulled him toward sleep despite his resistance, his fear that the bear would be waiting in his dreams. As consciousness slipped away, his last thought was of the massive predator lumbering away through the underbrush, disappearing into the vast Montana wilderness that had suddenly become much more threatening than magnificent. Morning arrived, with a shaft of sunlight through the hospital window and the clatter of breakfast trays in the corridor. Mark had slept fitfully, drifting in and out of consciousness, haunted by fragmented dreams of pursuit and pain. His left shoulder and arm throbbed relentlessly beneath their bandages, a deep, bone-deep ache that the IV painkillers only partially subdued. A nurse entered with his breakfast tray, bland hospital fare that held little appeal, and checked his vitals. "Dr. Wilkins will be by on rounds in about an hour," she informed him. "And you have a visitor, Forest Service Ranger. Should I tell him to come back later?" Mark shook his head, suddenly eager for information. "No, I'll see him now." The ranger, who entered a few minutes later, was a solid, outdoorsy man in his 50s, with weathered skin and alert eyes that missed nothing. He introduced himself as Ranger Dave Callahan, setting a folder on the bedside table. "Mr. Stevens, how are you feeling this morning?" he asked, his tone professional but compassionate. "I've been better," Mark replied with a weak attempt at humor. Ranger Callahan nodded, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "I understand completely. I've been working in grizzly country for 23 years and I've seen my share of encounters. Mind if I ask you a few questions about what happened?" For the next 30 minutes, Mark recounted the events at Bone Crusher. Rapids in excruciating detail, the sudden appearance of the bear, his attempt to retreat, the fall that had triggered the attack, and the rescue that followed. Ranger Callahan took notes, occasionally asking for clarification but mostly listening attentively. "Based on your description and the fur samples we collected, we're dealing with a mature male grizzly, probably around 15 years old," the ranger explained when Mark had finished. "We've documented this bear before, tagged him 3 years ago during a population study. Beardsir 237. He's been relatively conflict-free until now, staying mostly in the backcountry away from human activity. Will you do anything about him?" Mark asked, surprised by his own ambivalence. Part of him wanted retribution for what the animal had done to him, but another part recognized that the bear had simply been a wild animal defending its territory. Ranger Callahan seemed to understand the complexity of his feelings. "In this case, no. The bear didn't demonstrate predatory behavior. It didn't stalk you, didn't attempt to feed on you, and retreated when confronted with the pepper spray. This reads as a defensive encounter. The bear felt threatened and responded accordingly." He flipped through some papers in his folder. "We'll increase patrols in that area and post warning signs about recent bear activity. We may temporarily close that portage trail while we monitor the situation, but unless this bear shows escalating, aggressive behavior toward humans, we'll leave him be." Mark nodded slowly, processing this information. "So he just goes on with his bear life, and I go on with 16 weeks of recovery and physical therapy." The ranger's expression was sympathetic but firm. "I understand that might not feel fair from where you're sitting right now, but from a wildlife management perspective, we try to balance human safety with conservation goals. Bears, especially grizzlies, are a threatened species trying to survive in an increasingly human-dominated landscape." He leaned forward slightly. "If it helps, that bear probably isn't having a great day either. Bear spray contains capsaicin, concentrated at about 10 times the strength of the hottest pepper on Earth. His eyes, nose, and mouth were likely burning for hours. It's a powerful deterrent, specifically because it creates such an unpleasant experience. One, the bear will remember and associate with humans." Mark couldn't summon much sympathy for the bear's discomfort, but he appreciated the ranger's honest approach. "Will this make the news? I'm not looking for publicity. We've filed it as a standard wildlife incident report. Local papers might pick it up. Bear encounters do generate interest, but your name will be kept confidential unless you choose to speak publicly." Ranger Callahan handed him a card. "My contact information, if you have any questions or concerns. We would like permission to use the details of your encounter for our educational programs, anonymized, of course. These real-life incidents help us teach people how to stay safe in bear country." "That's fine," Mark agreed readily. If his experience could help someone else avoid a similar fate, some good might come of it. The ranger stood to leave, collecting his papers. "One more thing, Mr. Stevens. When you're recovered enough, we'd welcome your participation in one of our bear safety workshops. First-hand accounts are invaluable for teaching proper wilderness preparation and response." After the ranger departed, Mark picked at his now cold breakfast appetite diminished by the conversation and the persistent pain. He was just pushing the tray aside when Dr. Wilkins arrived for morning rounds, accompanied by a younger doctor she introduced as Dr. Patel, the plastic surgeon who had assisted with his case. The examination was thorough and painful, despite their gentle handling. When the bandages were removed, Mark got his first real look at the damage, a series of deep, now sutured gashes across his left shoulder, extending down his upper arm, the skin around them angry and swollen, the puncture wounds from the bears. Teeth were smaller but numerous, each marked by a drainage tube and its own set of stitches. "Everything looks as expected at this stage," Dr. Wilkins assured him, as the wounds were cleaned and rebandaged. "No signs of infection yet, but we'll continue IV antibiotics for at least 48 hours. Dr. Patel explained the likely progression of his scarring and potential options for revision surgeries later, if Mark desired them. "However," the surgeon added, "many of our patients who experience wildlife encounters eventually view their scars as badges of survival rather than disfigurements to be corrected." Mark wasn't ready to embrace that perspective yet. The wounds, too fresh, the trauma too immediate, but he filed the thought away for future consideration. Jason arrived shortly after the doctors left, bringing toiletries from Mark's car and news that Layla had successfully retrieved the Subaru from the put-in point. They spent an hour in comfortable conversation that carefully skirted around the details of the attack, focusing instead on practical matters, how Mark would manage at home during recovery, arrangement of follow-up appointments, notification of his employer about his extended absence. "I called Melanie," Jason mentioned, referring to Mark's sister in Chicago. "I hope that's okay. She's flying in tomorrow, says she can stay for a week to help you get settled at home." Mark felt a surge of gratitude, both for Jason's thoughtfulness and his sister's immediate response. "Thank you. That'll help a lot." Later that afternoon, a local reporter somehow got wind of the story and called the hospital room directly. Mark declined the interview, unwilling to become a brief sensation in the local news cycle. He could already imagine the sensationalized headlines: "Montana man survives vicious grizzly attack," or "Killer bear still at large in glacier country." The reality of his experience was profound enough without media distortion. By evening, the initial shock had begun to give way to a deeper emotional processing. As he lay in the hospital bed, watching the Montana sunset paint the distant mountains visible from his window, Mark found himself replaying not just the attack, but the moments leading up to it, the decisions made, the paths taken, the split-second reaction that might have gone differently if he'd been more alert or moved more carefully. The hospital psychologist who visited briefly suggested this was normal, the mind's attempt to establish control over a chaotic, traumatic event by identifying ways it might have been prevented. The if-only spiral, she called it, warning Mark to be gentle with himself in the weeks ahead. "You encountered a wild predator in its natural habitat," she reminded him. "There's no perfect response to that situation. You survived. That's what matters." Sleep came more easily that night, aided by exhaustion and medication. The dreams, when they came, were still filled with pursuing bears, but now included moments of escape, glimpses of safety just beyond reach. The next 2 days passed in a fog of pain medication, medical procedures, and brief visits from Jason, Layla, and eventually Melanie, who arrived on the afternoon flight from Chicago, her face tight with worry until she saw her brother awake and coherent. "You look terrible," she said by way of greeting, squeezing his right hand tightly. "So everyone keeps telling me," Mark replied with a faint smile. By the 4th day, his condition had improved enough for discharge planning to begin. The antibiotics had prevented infection, the surgical sites were healing appropriately, and the pain had decreased enough to switch from IV to oral medication. Dr. Wilkins provided detailed wound care instructions and a referral to a physical therapist in Bozeman who specialized in trauma recovery. "The most important thing is to follow the therapy regimen exactly," she emphasized during her final examination. "Don't push too hard, too fast, but don't skip sessions either. Finding that balance will determine how much function you ultimately recover." Mark nodded, already wondering how his life would reshape itself around this new reality. Would he ever kayak again? The question had hovered at the edges of his consciousness since the attack, unasked until now. "Doctor," he began hesitantly, "realistically, will I be able to return to activities like kayaking? Fears are important to me." Dr. Wilkins considered the question thoughtfully. "With diligent physical therapy and barring any complications, yes, I believe you will. Your injuries, while serious, didn't damage the joint capsule itself or sever any major tendons. You're looking at reduced strength and some limitation in range of motion for several months, but I've seen patients with similar injuries return to demanding physical activities," she added with a slight smile, though perhaps choosing rivers with fewer grizzly bears might be advisable. The comment, intended to lighten the moment instead, sent an unexpected chill through Mark. The idea of returning to any wilderness area suddenly seemed daunting, a realization that shook him more deeply than the physical injuries themselves. He'd always found peace and purpose in wild places. Would that relationship now be forever tainted by fear? Melanie drove him home to Bozeman the following morning, his left arm immobilized in a sling, a bag of prescription medications on his lap. The 3-hour drive provided ample time for reflection as the Montana landscape rolled past the passenger window, the same majestic mountains and forests that had always called to him now seeming somehow more ominous, harboring hidden dangers he'd always intellectually acknowledged but never truly felt until now. His modest 2-bedroom house welcomed him with the slightly stale air of a place unoccupied for several days. Melanie fussed around him, opening windows, preparing the guest room for her stay, arranging his medications on the kitchen counter in precise order of scheduled administration. "I've stocked the fridge," she told him, helping him settle on the living room couch, "and I can work remotely for at least a week, longer if needed." Mark felt a complex mixture of gratitude and discomfort at requiring such care. At 42, he'd been fiercely independent for decades, shaped by the self-reliance that Montana culture valued. Now temporarily unable to perform even simple tasks like washing his hair or preparing a meal with his dominant arm immobilized, he faced a humbling period of dependency. "Thanks, Mel," he said simply, knowing his sister understood the depth of feeling behind the inadequate words. The first week of recovery passed in a blur of pain management, awkward one-handed daily activities, and fitful sleep interrupted by vivid dreams of pursuit. Melanie's presence was a godsend. Her practical efficiency, keeping the household functioning while her dry humor prevented Mark from sinking too deeply into self-pity. Jason visited regularly, bringing updates from their shared circle of kayaking, friends all shocked, all sending their best wishes, and during his second visit a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "What's this?" Mark asked, awkwardly tearing the paper with his right hand. "Open it," Jason urged. Inside was a small wooden carving of a grizzly bear, beautifully detailed right down to the distinctive shoulder hump and dish-shaped face. Mark stared at it, unsure how to react. "It's from Rick Henderson," Jason explained, referring to a mutual friend who did woodworking. "He said sometimes the best way past a fear is to face it, even symbolically. Keep your enemy close, that kind of thing." Mark turned the carving over in his hand, feeling the smooth wood grain beneath his fingers. His initial impulse was to reject it, to hide the reminder of his trauma in a drawer. But something in the craftsmanship, the care with which Rick had captured the essence of the animal without demonizing it, gave him pause. "Tell him thanks," he said finally, placing the carving on the coffee table where he could see it. Perhaps there was wisdom in confronting the source of his fear rather than avoiding it. Physical therapy began the following week, a grueling process that introduced Mark to new dimensions of pain. His therapist, Angela, was a compact woman with strong hands and an uncompromising approach to rehabilitation. "The bear did the damage," she told him during their first session, as she gently but firmly manipulated his injured shoulder. "But I'm the one who'll make you curse. Difference is I'm doing it to help you heal." True to her word, the exercises she prescribed pushed Mark to the edge of his tolerance, then a careful step beyond. Each session left him drained and sore, but the small improvements, an additional few degrees, of movement, the ability to lift his arms slightly higher, provided tangible evidence of progress. By the 3-week mark, with Melanie reluctantly returned to Chicago and Mark adapting to managing on his own, a local newspaper finally ran a small article about the incident. "Bozeman man survives grizzly attack on Flathead River," read the headline on page 3 of the Montana Daily Chronicle. The piece was factual rather than sensationalized, quoting Ranger Callahan about bear safety and noting that the animal had not been euthanized given the defensive nature of the encounter. The article generated a small flurry of attention, concerned calls from more distant friends and acquaintances, a few curious glances at the grocery store from people who recognized his name, an invitation from a local outdoor club to speak about wilderness safety that Mark politely declined. But public interest waned quickly, the news cycle moving on to more current events. What didn't fade was Mark's own psychological response to the trauma. As his physical wounds began to heal, the emotional impact emerged more clearly. Nightmares persisted, now less about the attack itself and more about being trapped, unable to escape from unseen threats. He found himself startling at unexpected sounds, his heart racing at the rustle of branches against his bedroom window during windy nights. Most troubling was his new reaction to the wilderness he'd always loved. When Jason suggested a gentle day hike on a popular trail near town, Mark's immediate internal response was fear, not just reasonable caution, but a visceral, throat-tightening panic at the thought of moving among trees that might conceal predators. He forced himself to accept the invitation, determined not to let the bear take this from him too. The hike was physically manageable, his recovery progressing well enough for modest exertion, but mentally, every shadow between trees, every moving branch became a potential threat. He caught himself scanning constantly for danger, unable to settle into the peaceful communion with nature that had always been his solace. "It'll get easier," Jason assured him afterward, clearly noting Mark's tension throughout the excursion. "First time back is the hardest, like getting back on a horse after being thrown." Mark nodded, wanting to believe him. "Yeah, just need more time, I guess." At his 6-week follow-up with Dr. Wilkins, the physical news was overwhelmingly positive. The wounds had healed cleanly, the scars still angry and red but showing good signs for eventual fading. Range of motion was returning gradually, and the nerve function tests showed no permanent damage. "Physically, you're right where we'd hoped to see you at this stage," Dr. Wilkins told him, making notes in his chart. "How are you doing otherwise? Any sleep issues, anxiety, flashbacks?" Mark hesitated, then admitted to the persistent nightmares and his new apprehension about wilderness areas. The doctor nodded understandingly. "That's textbook post-traumatic stress response, Mr. Stevens. Completely normal after what you experienced." She wrote a referral to a therapist who specialized in trauma and outdoor-related incidents. "I strongly recommend at least a few sessions." She works specifically with people who've experienced traumatic events in wilderness settings, climbers who've had serious falls, hikers struck by lightning, and yes, animal attack survivors. Mark took the referral, promising to call. He'd never considered therapy before, viewing it somewhat skeptically through the lens of Montana's stoic culture. But the persistent fear was becoming its own kind of prison, one he desperately wanted to escape. Dr. Houghton, the trauma therapist, maintained an office with large windows overlooking a small wooded area, a deliberate choice, she explained during their first session, to help clients reconnect with natural settings in a safe environment. Her approach was practical and direct, focusing on specific techniques to manage anxiety and process traumatic memories. "Your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do," she explained during their second meeting. "You encountered a life-threatening situation, and now your amygdala, your brain's alarm system, is hypersensitive to anything that might represent a similar threat. Our job is to recalibrate that system." The techniques she taught seemed deceptively simple: controlled breathing exercises, grounding practices that used sensory awareness to stay present, and a gradual exposure approach that would slowly reintroduce Mark to increasingly wild settings at a pace his nervous system could handle. "The goal isn't to eliminate fear," she emphasized. "Healthy fear keeps us alive in genuinely dangerous situations. The goal is to distinguish between reasonable caution and paralyzing anxiety, to find your way back to a relationship with wilderness that includes appropriate risk assessment without overwhelming dread." By the 8th week post-attack, Mark had progressed enough physically to return to work part-time, his left arm functional though still weaker than before. His colleagues welcomed him back with a mix of concern and the slightly awkward fascination people often display toward those who've survived extraordinary events. "Did you see its eyes?" asked Craig from accounting during Mark's first lunch break, leaning forward eagerly. "They say you can see a predator's intent in its eyes." Mark shook his head, suddenly weary of the question. "It happened too fast," he replied, the standard answer he'd developed to deflect such inquiries. The truth was more complex. He remembered the bear's eyes with perfect clarity, small, dark, and utterly alien. Not malevolent, not calculating, simply other. The eyes of a creature following imperatives he could never fully comprehend, operating according to rules shaped by millions of years of evolution in environments humans had only recently begun to explore. That weekend, following Dr. Houghton's graduated exposure plan, Mark drove to a popular state park where well-traveled paths circled a small lake. Jason accompanied him, respecting Mark's need to move at his own pace, never pushing, but always steadily present. They walked in comfortable silence, the late summer sun warming their shoulders. Mark found himself gradually relaxing as they completed the first mile without incident, his breathing slowing, his hypervigilance easing slightly. "How's the shoulder?" Jason asked as they paused at a scenic overlook. Mark rotated it experimentally. "Better. About 60% range of motion now. Angela thinks I might get to 80 or 90 eventually. Good enough for paddling?" The question hung in the air between them. Mark hadn't been in a kayak since the attack, hadn't even discussed returning to the sport that had been central to his identity for so long. "Maybe," he said finally. "Flat water to start, if I do. No whitewater for a while." He gazed out over the lake, its surface rippling in the light breeze. "And definitely no portages around rapids." Jason nodded, understanding. One step at a time. They completed the loop around the lake without incident, a small victory that left Mark feeling cautiously optimistic. The next week, they ventured to a slightly more remote trail, and the week after that, a true backcountry path, though still well-traveled and close to town. Each excursion was challenging in its own way. Mark found himself startling at unexpected movements, tensing at the sound of breaking branches, compulsively checking that his new canister of bear spray was accessible at his hip. But each trip also brought moments of the old connection, brief intervals when the beauty of his surroundings broke through the hypervigilance and touched something essential in his spirit. During one such moment, standing on a ridgeline overlooking a sweeping valley of lodgepole pines, Mark turned to Jason with sudden clarity. "I understand now why the ranger didn't track down the bear," he said. "This is his home, I'm just a visitor here." Jason studied him thoughtfully. "That's pretty philosophical for a guy who almost had his arm ripped off." Mark shrugged his still stiff left shoulder. "Don't get me wrong, if that bear walked up right now, I'd empty this entire can of spray on him without hesitation. But in the larger scheme, he was just being a bear, doing what bears do. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time." The realization didn't eliminate his fear or erase his trauma, but it offered a framework for reconciling with what had happened. An easy way to acknowledge the wildness of wild places without demonizing the creatures who inhabited them. As autumn painted the Montana landscape in gold and crimson, Mark continued his dual journey of physical and psychological healing. The scars on his shoulder and arm faded from angry red to silvery pink, still dramatic, but no longer raw. His strength and range of motion improved steadily under Angela's relentless physical therapy regimen, reaching a plateau that would likely be permanent. Functional but with limitations, as she described it. The mental scars proved more stubborn. Nightmares still disrupted his sleep several times a week, though their intensity had diminished. Sudden noises could still trigger a spike of adrenaline that left him shaky and hyper-alert, but the crippling anxiety that had initially prevented him from enjoying natural settings had receded to a manageable wariness. In late September, 11 weeks after the attack, Mark made a decision. He called Jason on a Tuesday evening with a simple question: "Think the lake's too cold for kayaking this weekend?" The silence on the phone lasted just a moment before Jason replied, understanding the significance of the query. "Not if we wear wetsuits. Conditions looks perfect for Saturday." That Saturday morning found them at the shores of Hyalite Reservoir, a calm lake nestled in the mountains south of Bozeman. The air carried the first real crispness of autumn, the surrounding peaks already dusted with early snow. Their breath formed small clouds as they unloaded their kayaks from Jason's truck. Mark surveyed his lime-green dagger with mixed emotions. The boat had been repaired where it had been scraped during the bear encounter, but he deliberately left one small gouge untouched, a tangible reminder of what had happened and what had nearly been lost. Launching proved more physically challenging than he'd anticipated. His left shoulder protested as he pushed off from shore, the familiar paddling motion awakening twinges in muscles that had been torn and repaired. But once on the water, something shifted. The gentle rocking of the boat beneath him, the clean slice of his paddle through the clear mountain lake, the rhythm of stroke after stroke, all felt like coming home. They paddled the perimeter of the lake in companionable silence, maintaining a steady pace that challenged Mark's endurance without overtaxing his recovering body. No white water, no rapids, no portages, just the pure elemental connection between paddler and water that had drawn him to the sport in the first place. As they completed their circuit and approached the shore where they'd launched, Mark paused, letting his kayak drift gently on the calm surface. He gazed at the forested slopes surrounding the lake, the wilderness that had both almost taken his life and had always given it meaning. Somewhere in those vast Montana forests, Bear No. 237 was preparing for winter hibernation, fattening on berries. and whatever protein sources he could find before the deep snow came. The grizzly would have no memory of the human he'd encountered on the trail, no concept of the lasting impact of that brief, violent interaction. He was simply living according to ancient imperatives, navigating a world increasingly fragmented by human presence. Ready to head in? Jason called from a few yards away. Mark took a deep breath of the pine-scented mountain air, feeling the pull of the wilderness, even through the caution that would now always accompany it. "Yeah," he replied. "I'm ready." He dipped his paddle into the clear water and pulled, his kayak responding with a smooth forward glide. His left shoulder ached with the motion, the healing tissue protesting but functional. The physical pain would fade further with time. The psychological wariness might never entirely disappear, but he was finding his way back to the water, to the wilderness, to himself. As Mark's kayak nosed onto the pebbly shore, he realized that he and the bear now shared something beyond their brief, violent encounter. Both would carry marks from that day on the Portage Trail, he and the scars across his shoulder, the bear in its wariness of humans reinforced by the searing experience of pepper spray. Both would continue to move through the same landscapes, more alert for each other's presence, finding ways to coexist in a wilderness big enough for predator and prey, for danger and beauty, for fear and freedom. Mark stepped carefully from his kayak onto the solid ground of Montana, the place he called home despite its hazards, or perhaps in some complex way because of them. The memory of teeth and claws would remain with him always, but so would this. The feeling of gliding across mirror-smooth water, mountains reflected in its surface, and the knowledge that beyond every fear lay the possibility of return.